Chapter 1. Pei Chichi felt like she was about to die. So hot, so uncomfortable, in the long and luxurious corridor of the hotel, she ran with all her might barefoot, trampling on the light refracted by the chandelier. In the quiet space, there was only her panting and messy footsteps behind her. Those men were so close that they could catch up with her at any time. She tugged at the collar of her dress in discomfort. Her hand was covered with a thin layer of sweat. The collar was pulled open a little, and a cool breeze seeped in, making her feel better, but it wasn't enough. She wanted more. "Chase this way." A hoarse voice of a man rang in her ears. The voice was very close, and it was mixed with some rough words. Pei Chichi shook her dizzy head, but her body slowly came to a stop. She couldn't run anymore. Her back was pressed against the door of a room. The black dress on her skinny body had been torn to shreds, and her long black hair was scattered messily on her fair shoulders, making her thin shoulders look even more crystal clear. Her small oval face was embedded with exquisite features. At this moment, her thin rose-like lips were tightly pursed and trembling slightly. She was breathtakingly beautiful. She could almost imagine what would happen to her if she was caught. Her stepmother's ugly face carried a hint of a sneer as she personally sent her to the bed of that terrible old man. "Pei Chichi, you're destined to lose money. Raising you is the only use you have." She was close to despair. Her little face was abnormally red, and her watery eyes were wide open. She couldn't escape, but at this moment, the door behind her was actually not closed, and a force made her fall into it quickly. As if it had its own will, the door closed automatically. The heavy door shut all the footsteps outside into another world. It was very quiet, very quiet. She fell onto the soft carpet. Even though her head was dizzy, she could still feel that this place was very, very, very luxurious. The European design, from the furniture to the ornaments, were all luxurious to the extreme, and all of them were famous products. Just the 18th century glass vase beside her was worth 20 million USD, not to mention the paintings on the wall. However, none of these could compare to 1/10 of the elegant man who was leaning on the sofa. The snow-white bathrobe was loosely wrapped around his body, and the collar was slightly open. His exquisite collarbone could be seen, and above that was an extremely perfect face. It was cold, without a trace of humanity. At this moment, the elegant man was supporting his forehead with one hand as if he had fallen asleep. However, there was a faint smell of alcohol on his body. Pei Chichi felt that her body was getting hotter. She walked over uncontrollably, almost as if she was possessed. Her intuition told her that he had something she wanted. Unable to restrain herself, she half knelt in front of him. Her fingers trembled as they reached for the collar of his bathrobe. Her mouth moved closer and kissed him clumsily. All he knew was that he could free her from this pain. That pair of cold eyes suddenly opened, and the owner of those eyes subconsciously wanted to push her away. However, when his fingers touched her, they landed on her little face. That beautiful touch made him change his mind, and his hands clasped onto her shoulders. Her lips were very fragrant and very soft. The kiss slowly deepened, and when it became unbearable, he forcefully pressed her down. The night was very long. Chapter 2. Early in the morning, Pei Chichi opened her eyes. She felt as though her entire body had been crushed, especially her throat, which felt as though it was on fire. She lowered her head and saw a hand on her waist. That hand was clean and bony, and it was holding her waist dangerously. She turned her head and saw a handsome and elegant face. The man had not woken up and was still in a deep sleep. Perhaps it was because he was exhausted. She was stunned for a moment before she carefully moved herself to the side of the bed. The moment she landed on the ground, she felt as though her entire body had been split apart. It was so painful that her forehead broke out in cold sweat. She looked around and did not see any clothes for her. She had no choice but to enter the changing room that was connected to the bedroom. The morning light, through the curtains, shone on the young body, also reflecting the traces of crimson on his body. It was warm and seductive. Pei Chichi casually took out the only set of men's clothes and put them on with trembling hands. The oversized clothes were a little ridiculous on her, but she could not care less. When she went out, she did not dare to look at the man on the bed. She hurriedly picked up the small bags that were scattered on the floor. Suddenly, A large palm grabbed her arm. With a slight tug, she fell into a warm embrace. The man held her with one hand while his other hand slowly caressed her little face. He pinched her delicate chin and forced her to raise her head. Their eyes met. Pei Chichi's heart was trembling. The man she had slept with had woken up. He looked like he had gone crazy, but his entire body was exuding a dangerous aura. Tang Yu's gaze was deep as he locked his eyes on her little face. His voice was deep and slow. "What's your name?" He was drunk last night, but he was not so drunk that he had forgotten what had happened. His body felt a sense of satisfaction that he had never felt before. When he woke up, he could smell a faint fragrance on his pillow. That was the unique scent of a girl. He remembered that when he did it with that girl last night, his face was buried in her neck, and her hair was scattered on the tip of his nose, of course, except when he came from behind. Obviously, she wanted to escape now. Pei Chichi bit her lip and laid on his body awkwardly. As their bodies rubbed against each other, his blanket slid down. His body was pressed against her little face. She could even smell the private scent on his body. Pei Chichi struggled a few times, but he easily held her in place. She was a little anxious, so she lowered her head and bit his body. Her sharp little teeth happened to bite his weak spot. Tang Yu let out a muffled groan and let go. Pei Chichi ran away. Tang Yu let out a long sigh and looked down at the wounds on his body. This was the first time a girl had left a mark on his body. Just now, in a moment of passion, he actually let her run away. Just then, the bedroom door opened. His personal assistant and good friend, Meng Qingcheng, pushed the door open and entered with a document in his hand. Tang Yu, in the next second, Meng Qingcheng's gaze froze because he saw something he shouldn't have seen. On Tang Yu's neck, there were still kisses from the Hun's mouth. "Tang Yu, kiss marks. Have you seen enough?" A cold voice sounded. Naturally, Meng Qingcheng did not dare to look anymore. Tang Yu lifted the blanket and got up, walking straight to the bathroom. Meng Qingcheng looked at his muscular body and wanted to whistle. However, he soon saw the red bloodstain on the snow-white bedsheet. He coughed lightly and asked the person who was about to enter the bathroom, "This blood, is it yours, or that woman's?" What answered him was a large bath towel covering his face, covering him from head to toe. Chapter 3. He waited patiently for a while, and Tang Yu finally came out of the bathroom. He was wearing a bathrobe with a loosely tied belt. Meng Qingcheng had never doubted Tang Yu's beauty. It was true. In B City, Tang Yu was a legend. He had a proud family background, strong abilities, and a face and body that could instantly kill those celebrities who relied on their looks to make a living. However, Tang Yu also had a flaw. This flaw caused him to not have any scandals around him. He was a neat freak. It was not that he had no interest in women, but whether it was with his ex-girlfriends or experienced prostitutes, he had never succeeded. Hence, he slowly lost interest. Meng Qingcheng really wanted to know who the woman from last night was. Just as he was about to ask, Tang Yu quietly said, "Help me find the woman from last night." Pei Chichi walked out of the hotel and went to the 24-hour supermarket to buy a long sportswear to cover the red marks on her body. In her hand was that man's clothes. She looked down for a while and finally threw them into the trash can. There were very few cars on the streets in the morning. The morning light shone through the concrete and steel of the entire city. Standing at the huge bus stop, she felt cold all over. From afar, she saw the number 6 bus. She got on the bus. It was very empty and there was almost no one inside. Pei Chichi sat down and looked outside with her face half tilted. Although Ju Mailin did not treat her well in the past, she would not use such a dirty trick. After Pei Ming was hospitalized, Ju Mailin seemed to have no scruples. Everything was not over yet. Pei Chichi was physically and mentally exhausted. She did not know how long it would take for her to be free. If it was not for Pei Ming, she would not have returned to that house. However, she remembered how difficult it was for that man to treat her well in secret and secretly give her pocket money. She closed her eyes and felt the sun on her face. There was a momentary warmth. Then, she smiled faintly, a smile that was a little bitter. After alighting at Sea City General Hospital, Pei Chichi bought a bag of apples from the fruit stall at the entrance and went up to the neurology department on the 4th floor. Pei Ming pushed the door open and moved his head slightly. Pei Chichi immediately walked over and said, "Dad, don't move." She put the fruit aside and covered him with the blanket. Last week, because of the financial crisis, the Pei Group's stock price plummeted. Pei Ming suffered a stroke on the spot. Although his condition had stabilized, he still had to stay in the hospital for another half a month before he could be discharged. "Why are you here so early?" Pei Ming stared at her face and asked with concern, "Your auntie didn't make things difficult for you, right?" Pei Chichi looked down and picked up an apple from the side. She peeled it for him and said casually, "Dad, don't worry. Auntie has been good to me these days." Although she was comforting him, Pei Ming sighed. How could he not know Ju Meilin's character? Pei Chichi was not his biological child, and he was not even his legitimate child. Ju Meilin had always been unable to tolerate it. If she found out that Chichi was not even his biological daughter, then, all these years, he had been struggling internally. And this struggle was because of his love for Chichi. It was all because of his incompetence. If he had been more capable, Chichi would not have had to suffer so much, and Ju Meilin would have been more restrained in front of him. Now that he was not home, he really did not dare to think about it. He took the apple from her hand and took a small bite. "It'll be better when Dad is home." Chapter 4. Hearing that, Pei Ming almost dropped the apple in his hand. He almost cried. Chichi looked tough, but she was more soft-hearted than anyone else. He reached out and touched his daughter's hair. It was black and soft, just like that person. Back then, that person was the most beautiful woman in B City. Many men fell for her, and he was just a guest behind her curtain. He knew very well that Chichi was not his child. But when she carried Chichi over, looking at that delicate little face and soft little body, Pei Ming would rather be a fool and accept her as his child. Now, that person was already married to someone else. She was no longer someone he could look up to. Chichi looked like her, but her character was different. "Silly, I know even if you don't tell me." Pei Ming held back his tears and said in a cheerful voice, "When I make a comeback, I'll secretly buy you an apartment. Then you won't have to suffer anymore." He seemed to be touched. "Chichi, you've grown up." As he said that, he choked a little. Pei Chichi knew how difficult it was for him to be sandwiched between her and Ju Meilin. She said softly, "Dad, there's no need. I just want you to be healthy. It's just a small stroke. It's no big deal." Pei Ming patted her little hand. "All right, go back. Your auntie will be here soon." Pei Chichi nodded. She knew that Ju Meilin would come around 8:30 every day. But she did not expect that when she returned home in Qingshui Road, Ju Meilin was still there. She sat in the living room and looked at Pei Chichi from head to toe. Her voice was full of sarcasm. "You're finally willing to come back, Auntie." Pei Chichi stood by the door with her back straight, her eyes guarded. Ju Meilin raised an eyebrow. "Why? Are you afraid that I'll drug you?" "Pei Chichi, Mr. Zhong doesn't have time all the time. You have to know that your father is lying in the hospital now. The Pei Corporation is short of tens of millions. How are they going to fill it? Mr. Zhong is rich and powerful. There's no better place for him to marry an orphan like you." Pei Chichi was so angry that her whole body was trembling. A good place to go. The man surnamed Zhong was already 50 years old, and his hair was almost bald. Instead of getting angry, she laughed and said, "I think Auntie is thinking of Pei Huan for this good place." Ever since Ju Meilin was born, she hated this little bastard the most. He always treated her ambiguously. Only Ming he treated her like a treasure. She laughed coldly. "Pei Huan already has a boyfriend. He's from the same school as you. His name is Lin Jinrong. He has a good family background and is a good match for Huan Huan." When she finished speaking, Pei Chichi's body turned cold. Lin Jinrong and Pei Huan are together. She stood erect, unable to move. After a long time, she lowered her eyes. "Is that so?" Bu walked into her room, closed the door, and pressed her back against the door. Her little face was slightly raised as tears rolled down her cheeks. Everything had changed overnight. She had no choice but to lose her first time, and also, the person she liked. And this person was together with her younger sister, Pei Huan. In fact, Pei Huan was older than her by a few days. In order not to let Pei Huan suffer, Zhu Meilin insisted that Pei Chichi was the older sister. An older sister should always give in to her younger sister, right? Pei Chichi raised her head and forced the tears back into her eyes. She walked into the bathroom in a daze and turned the water onto the coldest setting. She splashed it on her body until she became numb. The door was suddenly pulled open. Zhu Meilin stood at the door and looked at the hickeys all over Pei Chichi's young body. She screamed, "Pei Chichi, you little bitch. Which man did you sleep with outside?" Her fingers were pinching Pei Chichi's arm so hard that it almost bled. Pei Chichi shook off Zhu Meilin's hand forcefully. There was a bloody mark on her arm. Water splashed and slid past her face, making it a little blurry. Chapter 5. Zhu Meilin glared at her. "You wretch, how dare you talk to me like that?" Then, she laughed coldly. "Do you think that you're all grown up and that you're free? You want to walk away? You have to think about Pei Ming in the hospital. He's your father. Even if you want to walk away cleanly, you have to see if he's still alive after the company collapses." Pei Chichi's face turned pale. Zhu Meilin had grabbed hold of her life. To Pei Chichi, nothing in this world could compare to Pei Ming. Think about it, your father has always treated you like a precious baby. If you want to be an ingrate, I won't stop you. Zhu Meilin's gaze swept across her. "You're as cheap as your mother." Pei Chichi was already numb to these words. But she had never asked anyone who her mother was. To her, the woman who had abandoned her was not worthy of her love. Her only family was Pei Ming. Zhu Meilin walked out. Pei Chichi could vaguely hear her talking on the phone. Her tone was very flattering. The other party was Mr. Zhong. When she came out of the bathroom, Zhu Meilin looked better. "Mr. Zhong doesn't mind what happened last night. Of course, you have to be obedient from now on." Pei Chichi looked up at Zhu Meilin. Her gaze made Zhu Meilin shudder. What she hated the most was this kind of gaze. "Auntie, do you hate me a lot?" Pei Chichi laughed as she said, "I think so too. If I had a biological mother, how could she bear to marry me to an old man?" she said absent-mindedly. Then, she walked to the bed, lifted the blanket and lay down. She sounded tired. "Auntie, I'll go tonight. I want to rest for a while now." Zhu Meilin was furious. She was about to explode when she thought of how badly Pei Chichi had been messed with last night. She had to serve Mr. Zhong tonight. If she didn't rest well, how was she going to serve him? So she held it in and went out. As the door closed, Pei Chichi covered her face with the blanket. In the evening, Zhu Meilin took her to the hotel where they had been yesterday. Mr. Zhong was a minor shareholder of the hotel, so Zhu Meilin and him had been meeting there. Seeing that Pei Chichi was obedient, she sneered in her heart. Sure enough, after being raped, she didn't care anymore. She was the same as that bitch. Maybe when Mr. Zhong didn't want her anymore, Pei Chichi could be sold for a good price. After all, she was a rare beauty. When the car stopped, Zhu Meilin suddenly placed a small object in Pei Chichi's hand. Her voice was short and urgent. "Eat this." Pei Chichi lowered her head and saw that it was a box of morning after pills under the dim light. "After what happened last night, I don't think Mr. Zhong wants you to have someone else's seed." Zhu Meilin lowered her voice for fear that the driver in the front would hear her. She was mean to Chichi, but she had always put up a good front in front of others. Pei Chichi looked at it, then opened the box and dug out the 2 small pills from inside. He didn't drink any water and just swallowed them. Zhu Meilin's eyes widened when she saw how resolute she was. This girl might look gentle on the outside, but she was ruthless. She was determined to get rid of this girl while Pei Ming was in the hospital. Pei Chichi ate it too quickly. After swallowing it, she retched a few times. "Don't embarrass Mr. Zhong later. Mr. Zhong is also a respectable person." Zhu Meilin got out of the car and led her into the luxurious hall. The manager led them to a seat. Pei Chichi suddenly covered her mouth with her hand. Zhu Meilin was shocked. Chapter 6. Pei Chichi, don't play any tricks. Zhu Meilin looked at her suspiciously. She was still worried about what had happened yesterday. Pei Chichi put her bag in her hand and smiled coldly. My identification card is in here. Ju Mylin glanced at her and started to get intimate with her. Chichi, hurry up. I'll chat with Mr. Zhong for a while. She lowered her voice again. Don't say no to Mr. Zhong's request tonight. Do you hear me? If your dad's company doesn't have any funds, it'll be finish. I know. Pei Chichi closed her eyes and walked to the washroom. To prevent any accidents, Ju Mylin opened the bag and checked. There was indeed Pei Chichi's identification card inside. She immediately put on a smile and walked to Mr. Zhong's table. As soon as Pei Chichi was out of Ju Meilin's sight, she quickly took off her high heels and ran to the other side barefoot. Her heart was beating fast, because she only had this one chance. During the day, she noticed that there were people watching her from all around the villa. She couldn't fly out, so she had no choice but to follow Ju Mylin here. She had thought that Ju Mylin would give up after what had happened last night. She didn't expect that she would be so ruthless. Pei Chichi ran with all her might. Her fair and tender feet rubbed against the ground, and there were even scraps that pierced into her flesh, but she couldn't care less. Based on her memory, she found the sweet from last night. She leaned against the door and panted heavily. Although she had already thought about it, she hesitated at that moment. Was that person still there? If he was still there, she couldn't go back on her words after knocking on the door. She lifted her fingers slowly and knocked on the thick door. The sound was very, very soft. After knocking once, she didn't knock a second time, because she had used up all her courage. After what seemed like a century, the door opened from the inside. The person who opened the door was Tang Yu. He was wearing a white shirt and black trousers. It was simple, but very good-looking. Just by leaning against the door, he had already become a scenery. His expression was a little surprised, but there was also some understanding. All of a sudden, Pei Chichi felt extremely embarrassed. She moved her little feet together and moved them gently. The ink-colored dress was like a second curve that clung tightly to her body. Her hair was like ink, her skin was like porcelain, and her features were as fresh as a painting. His gaze moved downwards, and he saw her white little feet. Even her small feet were extremely beautiful. Each of her round little toes was as cute as a golden needle mushroom. He actually had the urge to put them in his mouth one by one. Her uneasy look also fell into his eyes. Tang Yu sized him up for a while before opening the door slightly. His voice was a little cold. Come in. There was no room for rejection. When Pei Chichi stepped in, the blood on the soles of her feet left a faint layer of red on the pure white carpet. Before the door could close, a sharp voice came from behind, Pei Chichi. Pei Chichi turned around and saw Ju Mylin and Mr. Zhong standing a few meters away. Ju Mylin glanced at Tang Yu and said politely with a hint of coercion, Sir, this is my daughter. She's a little disobedient, so I have to take her back to discipline her. Before Pei Chichi could speak, her body was pulled aside. The man next to her said lightly in a very elegant voice, Indeed, she's disobedient. Ju Mylin breathed a sigh of relief. That would be easy. But at this moment, Mr. Zhong's voice trembled. Mr. Tang, I'm sorry to disturb you. Mr. Tang? Chapter 7. Tang Yu glanced at the couple and said calmly, I also have a score to settle with your daughter. She raped me 5 times last night. Mr. Zhong broke out in a cold sweat. The elegant man continued, As a result, I couldn't attend an important meeting today and lost 2 billion yuan. Mr. Tang, I'm sorry for causing you trouble. Mr. Zhong swallowed his saliva and secretly glared at Ju Mylin. Look at what kind of trouble this jinx has caused him. Ju Mylin was still in a daze, but Tang Yu had already closed the door. She gritted her teeth and wanted to knock on the door, but Mr. Zhong stopped her. Ms. Ju, Mr. Tang is the CEO of Shengyuan. Shengyuan? The biggest business empire in B City and even the whole north. Ju Mylin put down her hand. Mr. Zhong said again, I can't afford to marry your daughter. He didn't dare to marry her. If he married a woman that Mr. Tang had slept with, did he not want to live in this world anymore? Mr. Zhong left very quickly. He had to come back another day to explain that this matter had nothing to do with him. However, this also depended on Tang Yu's attitude toward Pei Chichi. It was a pity. He had seen many beauties in his life, but it was rare to see someone as breathtakingly beautiful as Pei Chichi. Ju Mylin was left alone outside the door. She was afraid, excited, and unwilling. However, on second thought, with Mr. Tang's family background, he was at most fooling around. Why would he want to marry Pei Chichi? In the suite, separated by a door, Pei Chichi looked up at Tang Yu and moved her lips. He looked at her and her feet. Go sit on the sofa. I'll ask the doctor to bandage your wound. He didn't plan to stay here tonight, but strangely, he stayed an extra night. But when she came, the scene just now made him a little annoyed. If Meng Qingcheng found her, she would probably have been. He frowned and realized that he actually cared a little. This made him a little unhappy. Pei Chichi bit her lip and walked over carefully. Then, she looked at the door anxiously. Tang Yu knew what she was worried about and didn't say anything. He just sat on the sofa opposite her and crossed his legs naturally. His behavior was extremely elegant and pleasing to the eye. He picked up his cell phone and dialed Meng Qingcheng's number. Get me a surgeon, someone with good skills. It was just the soles of his feet. Leaving a scar would not look good. Most importantly, it would affect the feel of his feet. On the other side, Meng Qingcheng was a little surprised. You're injured. You don't have to find that girl for me. She's with me. Tang Yu didn't answer directly and hung up the phone. Looking at Pei Chichi's eyes, he smiled faintly and moved closer to her. Besides sleeping with me, you also bit me. You haven't forgotten, right? Pei Chichi raised her head and looked at him, unable to move her eyes away. On the other side, Meng Qingcheng thought about it for a long time before he realized that the person was right there and the person who was injured was. While he was in a daze, Tang Yu called again. You come over too. Bring a lawyer with you. Lawyer? Looks like there's a situation. Meng Qingcheng shook his head and immediately contacted someone. Half an hour later, the B City's surgical expert, lawyer, and Meng Qingcheng appeared at the entrance of the presidential suite. When Meng Qingcheng saw Ju Mylin, he almost rolled his eyes. This was the woman Tang Yu was looking for? Wasn't his taste a little too heavy? As he was thinking about it, the door opened. Chapter 8. Ju Mylin looked at the few people who had come. Her lips moved, but she didn't dare to say anything in the end. Mr. Zhong's words still had a deterrent effect. Meng Qingcheng slowly closed the door. The doctor had already walked in front of Pei Chichi, and he knew what was going on with just one look. Mr. Tang. He naturally knew Tang Yu. He nodded and squatted down. He looked up at Pei Chichi and smiled. It might hurt a little when I disinfect it later. Pei Chichi bit her lip and hummed. At this moment, she was feeling complicated. She was uneasy and flattered, which made her feel like a bird that was startled by the twang of a bow. The doctor opened the medicine box he carried with him, held her little foot, and cleaned her wound first. Even though he was over 40 years old, had a happy family, and was an upright person, his heart still couldn't help but sway when he held such a beautiful girl's foot. This had nothing to do with love, but a kind of man's instinct, called being moved. Tang Yu glanced at him indifferently. The doctor quickly gathered his thoughts and focused on treating the wound. Indeed, as he said, he had also lightened his strength, but Pei Chichi still frowned in pain and softly breathed in. Meng Qingcheng stared at it for a while, then looked at his CEO's somewhat unnatural expression. He could probably guess his dark thoughts, and he couldn't help but smile. Such a beautiful girl indeed made people feel protective of her. After cleaning, the doctor wrapped a thin layer of gauze for her, then looked up at her with this posture and smiled. Don't let it come into contact with water. It'll be fine in 2 days. Thank you. Pei Chichi said softly. The doctor smiled and didn't speak to her anymore. He stood up and said, Mr. Tang, it's not serious. I'll leave first. If it's possible tomorrow, go to the hospital to change the dressing, or I'll do it. Qingcheng, I'll call you then. Tang Yu said lightly. As soon as he said that, Meng Qingcheng knew that he had other arrangements. After the doctor left, the atmosphere became a little quiet and strange. Pei Chichi sat there, feeling very uncomfortable. She didn't know what to say. Tang Yu gestured for the lawyer to sit down, and he sat opposite Pei Chichi. His tone was gentle. I think you're looking for me. Is there something you need? Pei Chichi looked up, her eyes a little startled. How could a person like him not know why she was here? And these two people, one looked like someone close to him, and the other looked like a lawyer. She didn't say anything. Tang Yu continued, someone made things difficult for you, right? She nodded with difficulty. He smiled faintly. If you're willing, we can sign a contract, he said slowly. I'll buy you, and you can tell me how much you need. Although Pei Chichi expected him to make such a request, and this was also her goal, she hesitated. How could she afford to provoke someone who could make Mr. Zhong so afraid? Of course, you can also choose to leave. Tang Yu's body relaxed as he leaned back, his tone indifferent. He wasn't a philanthropist. If she wasn't willing, he wouldn't ask about her problems anymore. His kindness came with conditions. Pei Chichi clenched her hands tightly. In that instant, she thought of Pei Ming lying in the hospital, and Zhu Meilin's endless coercion. Her fingers sank deep into her flesh, and her pink nails turned extremely pale. Her flesh hurt, and she could only hear his faint voice in the midst of her blurry vision. You should change your bad habits, or I think the doctor will come again. Chapter 9. This smile softened his facial features. He was no longer as unapproachable as before. Instead, there was a touch of warmth. Pei Chichi was a little absent-minded again. Her lips were slightly parted. After a long time, she found her voice and said with a hint of hoarseness, I need 100 million. After saying that, her whole body felt soft and her hands and feet were cold. She had given a price to a man. But she didn't know if she was worth that much in his heart. Tang Yu looked at her deeply. Meng Qingcheng, who was standing by the side, had already brought the check over. Come on, it's worth it. My name is Tang Yu, he suddenly said. He took the checkbook, wrote a set of numbers on it, tore it off and put it in her palm. Pei Chichi looked down and saw, that was his name. Tang Yu. The man who bought her. Pei Chichi suddenly stood up and walked to the door. Hey! Meng Qingcheng called out. Tang Yu stopped him. Her feet were still hurting, but she still walked towards the door with determination. When she opened the door, she saw Zhu Meilin's face. That face was a little swollen because of excessive maintenance. A face that was originally beautiful but became ugly because of harshness. Step by step, she walked over and handed the check to Zhu Meilin. She said coldly, from now on, we don't owe each other anything. Zhu Meilin was still a little stunned. She looked down at the check and the sky-high number. She had always wanted to sell Pei Chichi for a good price. Now, her wish had come true. Looking at Pei Chichi's eyes, she shuddered. But money was a good thing, and the Pei group really needed money. She gripped the check tightly and said in a cold voice, Pei Chichi, from now on, I won't interfere in your affairs. As for Pei Ming, I think we both know how to be decent. How could Pei Chichi not know? Her lips twitched mockingly. Zhu Meilin returned the bag to Pei Chichi. I'll pack your things. As for whether you want them or not, it's up to you. I'll go back and get them. To her surprise, Pei Chichi said. Zhu Meilin looked at her for a while and then left quickly. After all, Tang Yu was someone she couldn't afford to offend. Moreover, the 100 million he gave her was more than double the 30 million that Mr. Zhong was willing to give her. Pei Chichi stood there until the pain was unbearable. Then, she turned around. Tang Yu was leaning against the door, still looking incomparably noble and elegant. She did not feel grateful to him. A man who was so generous to a woman only wanted one thing. She did not know that her young body was worth so much in his eyes. After all, with his conditions, there were many beautiful women throwing themselves at him. Returning to his suite, Meng Qingcheng said in a businesslike tone, Miss Pei, there's a contract here that I need you to sign. Back in his suite, Meng Qingcheng said in a businesslike tone, Miss Pei, here's a contract. I need you to sign it. Although it was business, it was still a little cruel to a young girl. In a short period of time, the lawyer had already drafted a contract. To put it bluntly, it was a contract of support. The lawyer had drafted a contract in a short time. To put it bluntly, it was a contract of support. 100 million was enough to buy her whole life. Unless Tang Yu was tired of it, Meng Qingcheng felt it was a pity, but to Pei Chichi, it didn't matter. She didn't have a life of her own from the moment she was born. The lawyer kept the contract and left. Meng Qingcheng didn't have any reason to stay. He said a few words and left. Chapter 10. Meng Qingcheng was a little surprised. To Tang Yu, that wasn't a meaningless place. He didn't say much but just nodded and left. After closing the door, Meng Qingcheng looked at Lawyer Li and smiled. Lawyer Li, please keep this a secret. We can't let anyone know about it. Especially Old Master Li, you know that too. Lawyer Li had a close relationship with the Tang family and had watched Tang Yu grow up. Of course I won't tell anyone. Lawyer Li smiled. He really couldn't tell that Tang Yu would buy a woman. After they left, Pei Chichi was a little nervous. Tang Yu glanced at her and seemed to know what she was thinking. If there's nothing else, go to bed. I have a video conference in America, she replied with an "oh" and relaxed. However, at this moment, her stomach grumbled. Just as he was about to leave, he paused and smirked. Hungry? Pei Chichi looked down. Her long eyelashes fluttered on her face like 2 rows of thick fans. Beautiful and cute. Tang Yu looked at her silently for a while. He thought that he bought her because she was indeed the only woman he could accept having a physical relationship with. On the other hand, it was because of her rare beauty. He picked up the phone, dialed the intercom, and ordered room service. After hanging up, he looked at her again. Open the door and get it later. Don't clean up. There will be someone to clean it tomorrow. He was probably very busy. After saying that, he walked into the study and closed the door. 2 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. Pei Chichi moved to open the door and the waiter brought over an exquisite Western meal. She hadn't eaten for a day and her stomach was empty. However, she couldn't eat anymore after a few mouthfuls. She didn't like Western food. After eating, she walked to the bedroom carefully and looked at the luxurious bed for a while. Then she lay down carefully and pulled the blanket up. She felt like a little lamb waiting to be slaughtered, ready to be enjoyed by the big bad wolf at any time. And the big bad wolf was in the study now. She was a little nervous and thought that she would not be able to sleep, but she was too tired. After struggling for a while, she fell asleep. When Tang Yu returned to the bedroom, she was still in a deep sleep. Her black hair was spread on the pillow, making half of her face look even more beautiful. At the tip of his nose, there seemed to be that clear fragrance floating around, hooking the dormant beast in his body to move. The blankets were kicked away. She was still wearing that black knee-length dress. The silk material clung to her body and was slightly rolled up at the base of her thighs. The faintly discernible scenery was the most seductive, not to mention that she was lying on his bed. Tang Yu reached out and slowly unbuttoned his shirt with his long and beautiful fingers. However, his gaze was fixed on her. Finally, he walked into the bathroom. When he came out, he was already refreshed. He changed into a clean bathrobe and laid down beside her, pulling the sleeping girl into his arms. After a while, he suddenly sat up and ran his fingers along her collar. He slowly tore the beautiful dress in half and threw it on the ground at the end of the bed. This way, it was much more comfortable to hug her. He didn't do anything but just hugged her and caressed her rather absent-mindedly, feeling her young body. He didn't hate it. In fact, he still had a strong urge to do it, even though he had really overdone it last night. Chapter 11. It was a different feeling to wake up in the arms of a man for 2 days in a row. Pei Chichi keenly felt that his hand was holding her. It was casual and there was a kind of leisurely feeling to it. She closed her eyes and wanted to pretend to be asleep, but she heard a clear male voice. "You're awake." There was no point in pretending anymore. Pei Chichi held her breath and looked over, only to see a pair of cold eyes. Luckily, he was wearing a bathrobe. She heaved a sigh of relief, but soon realized that she was in a terrible state. The dress she was wearing was gone. She maintained that position without moving until he moved his fingers away. And at that moment, his expression changed slightly. If his expression could be described as cold before, then at this moment, it was almost unapproachable. His entire body exuded a sense of alienation, which was commonly known as a forbidden jade. Pei Chichi nodded with difficulty. She moved her legs and immediately moaned in a low voice. Although it had been a day, it was still painful to wake up like this. Sensing the change in her expression, his gaze moved down and landed on the quilt she was covered with. She was sure that if he could see through it, he would be looking at that place. That night, we did it 5 times, he said casually, explaining why she was in so much pain. Pei Chichi knew what he meant. That night, she hadn't forgotten who was the one who took the initiative. She also looked at him secretly. That night, when she bit him, she didn't know if it was bleeding. Pei Chichi didn't see it, so she didn't dare to check it out. Tang Yu looked at her and smiled faintly, probably guessing what she was thinking. A little girl. Actually, she was so young that he was surprised. Only 20 years old. He knew that she was still in school. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Have you ever had a boyfriend? Tang Yu suddenly asked. Then, he leaned against the headboard and casually reached for the side of the bed. Soon, his slender fingers held a cigarette, but he didn't light it. But that kind of posture and those handsome features made her a little dazed for a moment. Pei Chichi tilted her head to look at him and shook her head. Perhaps her absent-minded expression pleased him. Tang Yu smiled and suddenly pulled Pei Chichi into his arms. This kind of contact made her a little embarrassed, because their bodies were stuck together. Her delicate chin was pinched, and his beautiful and long eyes locked onto hers. Pei Chichi's body was trembling, and she felt as though her entire body was being held in the palm of his hand. I want you to be loyal. He held her in his arms and kissed her. He didn't stop the kiss in time. Instead, he allowed it to ignite the flames in his body. Her little hand clasped helplessly on his shoulder, not knowing what to do. She clearly knew that at this moment, she should respond to him and make him happy, but she wouldn't. All she could do was let him kiss her, beg her, and her body stiffened as he kissed her. Relax. He whispered on the corner of her mouth, as though he was comforting her, but he didn't stop kissing her. She was trembling uncontrollably, but he was strong and firm. Suddenly, he stopped and stared at her with a burning gaze. Pei Chichi took a long time before she opened her misty eyes. Her eyes seemed to be covered with a layer of mist, and they were unbelievably beautiful. She looked at him in a daze. Her cheeks were red, and her red lips were moist. That look made him want to eat her up. His slender fingers gently stroked her red lips, and his voice became husky. Kiss me. Chapter 12. She was nervous. Although it was a little blurry the night before, she still remembered that brutal and terrifying power. She gasped and suddenly grabbed his finger to stop him from doing any more evil things. Tang Yu glanced at her. Her eyes were misty, and she looked lovely yet pitiful. She was clearly resisting, but she still had her reservations. She grabbed onto him, but she didn't dare to force him away. Instead, she was caught by him, and he teased her with his little hand, until she fell onto his shoulder, panting lightly. Her breathing was unstable, and her hair was scattered on her fair shoulders, wrapping around his. The two of them were lying on their sides, and it was really a little inappropriate. Pei Chichi bit her lip and looked up at him. Her voice was a little soft as she said, "Can we do it next time?" Tang Yu's bathrobe was open, and they were almost pressed together without any obstruction. She could feel that when the man woke up in the morning, he couldn't wait. Her little face was so red that it looked like it was dripping blood. He trapped her in his arms and didn't let go of her, but he didn't go any further. He only hooked her little chin and gently stroked her lips with his fingers. "Weren't you very bold that night?" Pei Chichi didn't dare to say that it was because she was drugged. She only trembled and silently begged him. She was still in pain and couldn't handle him one more time, or even a few more times. Just by being hugged by him like this, she could feel the clear difference in power between a man and a woman, and it made her afraid. Tang Yu wasn't a very greedy man, and he had already gotten used to it all these years. Even when he used his hands to solve it, it was very rare. Now that she was begging him like this, other than being a little pitiful, it was also a little fun. He let go of her and let her struggle out of his arms. He closed his eyes and quietly calmed down for a while before getting up. Other than her begging, he was indeed a little busy today. There was a very important meeting in the morning. Pei Chichi's clothes were torn into two. She looked at it in a daze, not knowing what to do. Tang Yu walked straight to the bathroom and said as he walked, Ching Cheng will bring clothes over later. Ching Cheng? Was it the man from last night? She didn't ask. She hugged the blanket, and while he was showering, she was allowed to stare blankly for a while. Tang Yu came out with only a towel wrapped around his waist. He glanced at her indifferently. Pei Chichi immediately sat up straight. She wanted to get off the bed, but she didn't dare to. He did not call for her service. After drying his hair slowly, he casually pulled out the towel around his waist. Pei Chichi's eyes widened at first, and then she immediately covered her eyes with her hands, not daring to look at him again. Tang Yu had long since calmed down, but now he was stirred up again. He glanced at her and walked over. Bending over slightly, he whispered into her ear, "Get used to it." As he spoke, his warm breath blew against her soft ears. Pei Chichi trembled. Tang Yu silently admired her blushing face for a while. He had no time to make things difficult for her, so he got up and went to the locker room to get dressed. After he was done putting on his clothes, Meng Qingcheng came over as well and conveniently brought a set of clothes for her. Tang Yu placed the clothes in front of her. He didn't have any intention of leaving immediately and stood at the side. She didn't dare to let him leave. Her hands were practically trembling as she put on the clothes. She looked up and met his eyes. Chapter 13. He seemed to be pressed for time, but why did he have the time to wait for her to get dressed? Pei Chichi didn't want to think about it. She watched him leave. Her legs were a bit weak. A conversation could be heard outside. It was Tang Yu talking to Meng Qingcheng. Pei Chichi walked out. Tang Yu glanced at her and whispered something to Meng Qingcheng. After he left, Meng Qingcheng smiled. "My name is Meng Qingcheng. I'm Tang Yu's special assistant. I grew up playing. You can look for me if you need anything in the future." He took out a business card and handed it to Pei Chichi. Pei Chichi took it and carefully put it in her pocket. "I haven't eaten breakfast yet. Before I go to my apartment in Xia City, I'll do you the honor." Meng Qingcheng was very easygoing. He was easy to get along with. Pei Chichi grunted. Meng Qingcheng opened the door with an extremely elegant demeanor. In fact, Tang Yu wasn't a very difficult person to serve. At least, he was gentle up until now. But Pei Chichi never felt that Tang Yu was easy to get along with. That kind of person, even an ordinary and indifferent expression would give people the aura of a superior. She was afraid of him. She was even more afraid of him in bed. Meng Qingcheng drove a white BMW. The style was quite standard. Pei Chichi was embarrassed to sit in the back, so she sat in the front. He was the one talking the whole way. The breakfast was surprisingly delicious. It was a Chinese-style breakfast. It soothed Pei Chichi's stomach, which had been uncomfortable for a long time. When they got back in the car, Meng Qingcheng fastened his seatbelt. He asked casually, "Oh right, that night, Tang Yu didn't take any precautions." He left some leeway for the rest of his words. Pei Chichi wasn't an idiot. She understood his meaning after a few seconds. She lowered her eyes and said softly, "I already took the morning after pill." This time, it was Meng Qingcheng who was stunned. In B City, which woman didn't want to climb into Tang Yu's bed? Which woman didn't want to be pregnant with Tang Yu's child? In the entire north, the Tang family's offspring were as precious as dragons. And Pei Chichi actually took the morning after pill. Of course, even if she didn't eat it, Tang Yu would let her eat it within 72 hours. Meng Qingcheng was stunned for a moment, then he said in an extremely gentle and tactful manner, "Don't take this medicine carelessly in the future. There are side effects. I'll get someone to prescribe some medicine. It's not that harmful to the body." Pei Chichi agreed softly. She could feel that Meng Qingcheng was already trying his best to protect her self-esteem and her body. In fact, whether she was well or not, wasn't that important to her. Perhaps the atmosphere was a little stiff. Meng Qingcheng said something dirty, that, "No man likes to wear that thing." After he said that, he couldn't help but swallow his words. Pei Chichi didn't say anything. She just sat there quietly. Meng Qingcheng glanced sideways at her. He also felt that it was a pity. Such a beautiful girl. He took her to an apartment in Xia City. This was one of the properties under Tang Yu's name. It was very close to the city. It could be said that every inch of land was worth its weight in gold. A square meter started at 100,000 yuan. No matter how young Pei Chichi was, she knew a thing or two about it. The apartment wasn't too big. It was about 100 square meters. It was only divided into a suite and a living room. It had everything one needed, and it didn't lack anything. This is the key. Meng Qingcheng handed her the key and a cell phone. Take this with you. The CEO will call when he wants to talk to you. Pei Chichi understood and took it quietly. Chapter 14. Thank you. She still had to thank him. Meng Qingcheng was kind to her. Meng Qingcheng smiled. He didn't stay for long and quickly left. After he left, Pei Chichi looked around. This place was decorated in a modern style. It wasn't particularly new, and there seemed to be signs of life here. Finally, she came to the changing room attached to the master bedroom and carefully opened the sliding door. Inside, there were rows of suits, indicating that Tang Yu lived here. Pei Chichi was a little stunned. She didn't remember wrongly. He said that he would only come over on Fridays and Saturdays. Then what about other days? Her heart was a little confused. At this moment, her phone rang. It was her classmate and good friend, Chen Xinjie. She sounded excited. Chichi, come to school quickly. Something good has happened. Pei Chichi looked around. In this space that was filled with Tang Yu's aura, even if he wasn't around, she still felt pressured. She lowered her voice. What is it? You'll know when you come, Chen Xinjie said briskly. Don't forget, you have an elective class in the morning. Pei Chichi looked at the phone that was hung up. She hesitated for a moment, but still decided to make a trip to school. Even if she was bought, she didn't plan to be Tang Yu's woman for the rest of her life. Besides, even if she wanted to, a man like him would only last for 2 to 3 years. She wasn't that naive. Under Zhu Meilin's influence, she already knew about Nuan and Lang Nuan. Compared to Pei Huan's willfulness, Pei Chichi felt that she was sometimes a little more sophisticated and not that likable. She took the bus to B City Academy and found the elective classes classroom. Chen Xinjie had already grabbed a seat for her. When she saw Pei Chichi, she immediately waved. Chichi, over here, over here. Her voice attracted the attention of many students. After all, Pei Chichi was the campus belle of B City. There were many male students who had a crush on her. Pei Chichi walked over and sat down. Chen Xinjie's gaze fell on her face. What happened? Pei Chichi inevitably felt a little guilty. She lowered her eyes and took the books and notes that Chen Xinjie had brought for her. Chen Xinjie's gaze was still on her face. She coughed lightly and said, "You look very different today." As he spoke, he paused and lowered his voice. "Chichi, don't you know that your little mouth is swollen?" Pei Chichi nodded and touched her lips with her fingers before she slowly said, "Last night, I was bitten by a mosquito." "That must be a male mosquito," Chen Xinjie teased. Pei Chichi still wanted to say something, but at this moment, she saw someone she shouldn't have seen. Pei Huan and Lin Jinrong. Lin Jinrong was in his 4th year of university, but he was taking the 2nd year's class. It was surprising that he had taken this elective course for 2 years. He was also very famous in B University, so Pei Chichi could be considered his classmate for 2 years. But Pei Huan did not take the elective course but came. At this moment, Lin Jinrong walked in front with one hand in his pocket and the other holding a casual bag. He calmly walked into the classroom. Pei Huan followed behind him, looking very princess-like. Her hair reached her shoulders, and she wore a white silk shirt and a black pleated skirt. The skirt was 10 centimeters above her knees, and it accentuated her fair and slender calves. Although they were not walking side by side, the intimacy between them made it obvious that they were together. Chapter 15. Pei Chichi looked down and didn't meet his eyes. She reached out to tidy up her things. Chen Xinjie looked at her and then at the couple. She said coldly, "I really didn't know that Lin Jinrong would like a white lotus." Her tone was full of indignation for Pei Chichi. Even a blind person could see that Lin Jinrong's attitude towards Pei Chichi was obviously to pursue her. But now, He was with Pei Chichi's sister. This was like a slap to Pei Chichi's face. Xinjie, stop. Pei Chichi lowered her voice. How much better could she be? She belonged to a man named Tang Yu now. She had no right to think about Lin Jinrong. Chen Xinjie muttered a few more words. Lin Jinrong's gaze fell on Pei Chichi, but she didn't look at him. At this moment, Pei Huan's fingers wrapped around his arm. Her voice was a little soft. Jinrong, let's sit over there. There were 2 empty seats next to Pei Chichi. It wasn't that there were no empty seats, but Pei Huan liked to tease Pei Chichi. She held Lin Jinrong's arm and walked towards Pei Chichi with a victorious smile on her face. She originally wanted to sit next to Pei Chichi, but Lin Jinrong beat her to it and sat next to Pei Chichi. Pei Huan was a little unhappy, but she didn't dare to show it because she was with Lin Jinrong. Pei Chichi's blood froze. How could she not know what Pei Huan was thinking? And Lin Jinrong, who was beside her, was a kind of torture. No one could be indifferent to someone after 2 years of liking them. But now, things were different. He was Pei Huan's boyfriend, and she was someone else's mistress. Pei Huan didn't listen to the class. Her face was resting on Lin Jinrong's arm. Almost no one was paying attention to the lecture. Instead, they were all looking over. Everyone knew that Pei Chichi and Pei Huan were sisters, and Lin Jinrong used to like Pei Chichi. After class, Pei Chichi immediately packed her things. Ignoring the stares of others, she walked quickly. Chen Xinjie chased after her. Chichi, wait for me. As for Lin Jinrong, he looked in the direction that Pei Chichi had left with a hint of pain in his eyes. He was very good-looking, handsome, and sunny. His hair was soft and fine. It was a little long for a guy, but it looked very elegant. There were many girls in B University who were infatuated with him, but he only liked Pei Chichi. He liked her for 2 years, but he never confessed. Last Wednesday was his birthday. Pei Huan took the invitation to his birthday party, but he wanted to give the invitation to Pei Chichi. That night, he drank too much and actually rolled onto the bed with Pei Huan. It was Pei Huan's first time, so he could only be responsible. Jinrong. Pei Huan tugged at his arm to express her dissatisfaction. Lin Jinrong stood up and said calmly, let's go. Outside, Chen Xinjie followed behind Pei Chichi. She pouted and said, all right, Chichi, I'm sorry. I didn't know that they would come together. Can you forgive me? She tugged at Pei Chichi's arm. Pei Chichi stood still. I'm not angry. In fact, she wasn't angry because she didn't have the right. She just didn't know what to do. Lin Jinrong and Pei Huan were together, and their relationship would be even more complicated. She might have to live under Pei Huan's piercing gaze for the rest of her life. Chapter 16. Chen Xinjie said mysteriously, my relative works at Shengyuan, and they need 2 working students to run errands. We just have to go there every day when we don't have classes. It's just a matter of 2 or 3 hours, and our monthly salary will be 4,000 yuan. Think about it, even the average wage earner will only earn a little more than that. She added, if we perform well, we can work at Shengyuan directly after graduation. That would be awesome. She patted Pei Chichi's shoulder and said sentimentally, so, men are nothing. Come on, child, let's throw ourselves into Shengyuan's arms. Shengyuan. Pei Chichi felt that the company's name sounded familiar, but before she could think about it, Pei Huan came over, alone. Pei Huan walked over and looked at Pei Chichi. She smiled sweetly and called her sister. Pei Chichi had already experienced her grumpiness, so she ignored it. Chen Xinjie, on the other hand, couldn't take it anymore. She said bluntly, who's your sister? How can you be so shameless as to steal your sister's boyfriend? Pei Chichi tugged at Chen Xinjie. Let's go. Stop. Pei Huan smiled like a cat. Who were you calling shameless just now? Pei Chichi, do I need you to tell me who's the shameless one? She leaned over and whispered into Pei Chichi's ear, is sleeping with a man you don't know glorious? Pei Chichi wasn't surprised that Zhu Meilin knew about it. How could Zhu Meilin not tell Pei Huan about such an interesting thing? She looked at Pei Huan and took a deep breath. Yes, I did sell myself. But Pei Huan, if I'm unhappy and tell my sugar daddy to deal with the Pei Corporation, do you think the bankrupt Pei family is still good enough for Lin Jinrong? Pei Huan looked angry, but she didn't explode. It was just as Pei Chichi had said. Moreover, she and Zhu Meilin still had wishful thinking. Although the Pei Corporation had survived the crisis, there was no guarantee that it wouldn't happen again in the future. So if Pei Chichi wanted to sell herself, she would let her. She smiled faintly and said affectionately, "Sister, my happiness depends on you." Pei Chichi was disgusted by her. Pei Huan's lack of integrity was completely inherited from Zhu Meilin. Chen Xinjie could not bear to watch any longer. She reached out and pulled Pei Chichi away. She only let her go when they reached a small forest. Her expression was a little serious, but she still deliberately said in a relaxed manner, "Tell me, what's the situation? Didn't you say you were going to work school? Tell me." Pei Chichi pushed him back. However, Chen Xinjie wasn't that easy to deal with. "Pei Chichi, are we still friends?" She almost fell out with him. "Of course. That's why I'm in trouble now, and I need you to help me work." Pei Chichi smiled. "It's not like you don't know me and Pei Huan. Xinjie, I've moved out, and I have to earn my own money." Chen Xinjie looked at her for a long time. Finally, she calmed down and patted her on the shoulder. "All right, start our little motor. Let's get going." Pei Chichi smiled as well. Chen Xinjie tilted her head. "Let's go. We're going to report." Pei Chichi shook her head and was dragged to Shengyuan with her on the bus. Below Shengyuan, Chen Xinjie's mouth was agape. She gulped and said, "It can't be." Even though she knew that Shengyuan was the leader of B City and the business overlord of the entire north, she didn't expect it to be so huge. Chapter 17. Pei Chichi also looked up and felt a little dizzy. The main building with 72 floors soared into the sky and became the landmark of B City. "Pei Chichi, we must make a name for ourselves here. In the future." Chen Xinjie stood by the side of the street and waved her fist. "This street is going to be ours." She even danced and shook her butt. "Damn it, Chichi." Pei Chichi's originally gloomy mood was washed away by her. She shook her head and smiled. "Aren't we going to report? Let's go." Chen Xinjie then retracted her supernatural power and pulled her inside. However, they did not notice that a car was slowly stopping in front of the building. In the car, Meng Qingcheng looked at Chen Xinjie through the window and found it interesting. However, what surprised him more was the person next to her. "Pei Chichi, why was she here?" He turned to look at Tang Yu in the back seat. Tang Yu was listening to the phone with a calm expression. He probably did not see them. Meng Qingcheng smiled and decided not to say it. Maybe something interesting would happen later. Pei Chichi and Chen Xinjie first looked for Chen Xinjie's relative, who was the leader of a small group. Through him, they went to the HR department on the 30th floor. Because someone had introduced them and they were students of B University, they were accepted without any difficulty. The requirement was to come over from 3 to 5 p.m. on Monday to Friday to do chores such as receiving documents. The salary was 4,000 yuan. Pei Chichi and Chen Xinjie were very satisfied. To Pei Chichi, although Tang Yu bought her, she had taken 100 million yuan from him. She still had to make a living, so she would not ask him for money. "Then let's start from today." The HR supervisor called someone over. "Xiao Liu, bring them around to familiarize them." The person called Xiao Liu was a young girl about 25 or 26 years old. She was wearing a professional suit and had a gentle expression. She nodded. "Okay, sister Wen." She led Chen Xinjie and Pei Chichi outside and began to explain Sheng Yuan's situation. "This building has a total of 72 floors. You are not allowed to go above the 70th floor." Chen Xinjie couldn't help but ask, "Why?" Xiao Liu smiled and said, "The 70th floor is the office of the higher-ups. They are all above the rank of vice president. The 71st floor is the conference room. The top floor is the president's office and lounge. One person occupies an entire floor." Chen Xinjie looked at the huge floor and exclaimed. Xiao Liu said proudly, "Last year, Shengyuan's headquarters alone achieved a turnover of 350 billion yuan. Wow! Chen Xinjie nudged Pei Chichi discreetly and lowered her voice. When can we contract this man who has 350 billion yuan? Pei Chichi smiled helplessly. After Xiao Liu finished speaking, he perked up as if he had been revived. I'll bring you to familiarize yourselves with each floor. After all, you'll have to deliver documents every day. Chen Xinjie caught the main point and pulled little Liu back. Every day? Every floor? Yes. Xiao Liu smiled. It's quite tiring. Originally, this work was done by the regular employees, but the higher-ups instructed us to do it. They said that it's such a simple job that doesn't waste brain cells, so there's no need for professionals to do it, so, she didn't finish her sentence. Chapter 18. Xiao Liu's face was full of yearning and admiration. It's our Mr. CEO. After running one lap, Chen Xinjie felt like her legs were about to break. She held onto the wall and walked out. Then, she said to Pei Chichi, I can't take it anymore, Chichi. This job is not for a human. I, Chen Wang, won't do it even if it's 8,000 yuan, let alone 4,000 yuan. She gritted her teeth again. Capitalists suck blood. Pei Chichi was actually tired, especially after she was tortured by Tang Yu the night before yesterday. She still felt uncomfortable today, and after walking so many floors, both her legs were wobbling. Don't you want to think about it more? She knew that Chen Xinjie's family was not poor. Previously, she thought that Chen Xinjie was probably thinking about what would happen after graduation. Chen Xinjie said without thinking, no need to think about it, Chichi. You don't know, but my feet are bruised. She secretly raised her hoof to show it to Pei Chichi. Pei Chichi looked at it. Yes, it was a little bruised. She thought about it and said, all right then, but I still want to do it. Chen Xinjie patted her. I will pray for you. You don't have to work so hard. Be smarter. Don't be so obedient without me protecting you in the future. Pei Chichi didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She let out a long sigh and said, Xinjie, thank you. She needed this job, otherwise, she wouldn't even have a problem eating. What are you thanking me for? If you really want to thank me, treat me to a bowl of beef noodles. Chen Xinjie rolled up her sleeves and was ready to eat to her heart's content. Meng Qingcheng walked towards the HR department, which naturally attracted the attention of the female employees. In Shengyuan, other than the CEO, Special Assistant Meng had the most power. Moreover, Meng Qingcheng was good-looking and was the second most eligible bachelor in Shengyuan. Even Sister Wen, the supervisor of the HR department, came to greet him personally. Special Assistant Meng, what instructions does the CEO have for you? No. Meng Qingcheng smiled. I just came to visit Sister Wen. Sister Wen was more than 40 years old, but being flirted with by such a handsome man, she blushed and said, don't talk nonsense. Don't I know you? Meng Qingcheng stopped joking around and looked outside the door. There are two young ladies here today. What are they here for? Sister Wen glanced at him and said, you're talking about those two. They're working students who deliver documents in the afternoon. But one of them probably doesn't want to come because it's too hard. What's the name of the one left behind? Meng Qingcheng immediately asked. Sister Wen smiled. Her name is Pei Chichi. She's very pretty. With that, Sister Wen let out a long sigh. She's really the most beautiful girl I've ever seen. She's gorgeous but not seductive, fresh and extraordinary. Meng Qingcheng had confirmed it. In fact, he quite agreed with Sister Wen's words in his heart. After all, if she could win Tang Yu's heart, her appearance wouldn't be bad. But he still made a joke. It seems that if Sister Wen is a man, she can't escape. If I'm a man, I'll take advantage of my position. For the first time, Sister Wen was not serious, which made the young ladies at the side a little stunned. Meng Qingcheng smiled. I'm afraid that the one who will take advantage of his position is Tang Yu. He returned to the 72nd floor in a good mood. When he opened the door of the CEO's office, Tang Yu was sitting at the desk and reading files. Chapter 19. It was noon, and the sun shone in through the window, enveloping the bookshelf behind him in the sunlight. It also made Tang Yu look like a god. The spacious space was very quiet, and only the sound of Tang Yu flipping pages could be heard, Meng Qingcheng closed the door gently and crossed his arms in front of him. He coughed lightly and said, "Look at you. You really look like you're only interested in work. Do you know what the outside world thinks of you? Workaholic sounds good. They say that your sexual orientation is unclear, and I'm the most pitiful one because I'm the scapegoat." As Meng Qingcheng spoke, he gestured to Tang Yu and himself. His meaning was very obvious. Tang Yu didn't even raise his head. He only said lightly, "You should be very clear about my sexual orientation, right?" He had slept with a girl 2 days ago, and it felt very good. He missed it very much, so he bought her. Qingcheng probably wouldn't forget about this. Meng Qingcheng walked forward and smiled. He leaned against Tang Yu's desk and said, "There's a hot girl in the HR department today. So you're going to pick her up?" Tang Yu lowered his head again and focused his attention back on the document. He only said lightly, "Don't forget Shen Yuan's rules." Meng Qingcheng smiled meaningfully. Remember, employees are not allowed to date each other. This rule was set by a certain inhumane Mr. Tang, but he was probably going to shoot himself in the foot in the future. However, that Pei Chichi was too careless. She actually didn't remember Tang Yu's identity. "That's good," Tang Yu said lightly and then threw the document in his hand forward. "Let Vice President Xu review this document again before handing it over. Tell him that he'll be retiring in 2 years. He doesn't want to lose his chastity in his old age, right?" Meng Qingcheng took it and looked at it for a while. His face also became serious. "Okay." Just as he was about to leave, Tang Yu stopped him. "Is the new female employee really that hot?" Meng Qingcheng's smile was a little lewd. "I thought you weren't interested in women." Tang Yu waved his hand and gestured for him to leave. Actually, he wasn't interested, but he was a little curious. Would she look better than Pei Chichi? Pei Chichi was the most beautiful girl Tang Yu had ever seen. Of course, this was only limited to when she was barefaced and naked. Women's makeup skills were magical, and she was a beautiful piece of jade. There were no flaws, and she didn't need them. Tang Yu lowered his eyes and smiled. He suddenly picked up the desk calendar and looked at it. Monday. It was only Monday. Friday and Saturday were the days when he went there to relax, but at this moment, he actually wished that today was Friday. The next day, Pei Chichi started working at Sheng Yuan after school. Just as Xiao Liu had said, this was a purely physical job. Actually, she was also curious why they didn't hire male working students for this kind of job. Later, Xiao Liu secretly told her, "It's the company's image." It was too profound. Pei Chichi couldn't understand it. She could only run errands from 3 to 5 in the morning. After 2 hours, her legs were shaking, but she still gritted her teeth and persevered. At 5 in the morning, she stood at the bus stop in front of the company, waiting for the bus. Sheng Yuan's employees came out in batches. Some drove their own cars, some took taxis, and there were also newcomers like her who waited for the bus. Pei Chichi looked at them and felt a little envious. Chapter 20. The bus arrived. Pei Chichi pulled at her backpack and got on the bus. The bus drove by slowly. She sat on the bus while Tang Yu's car passed by slowly below her. The car window was open. He held the steering wheel and focused on driving, passing by her. Pei Chichi did not return to the house in Xia City. Instead, she went to the hospital to visit Pei Ming. She bought a bowl of soup and brought 2 lunchboxes with her. Pei Ming looked at her. He was lying down at first, but he immediately perked up and sat up. "Chichi, you're here. Dad." Pei Chichi walked over and reached out to support him. She looked around. There wasn't even a caretaker. Pei Ming chuckled. "I'm fine. I'm doing very well. I heard from your auntie that the company's matter has been resolved. I'm happy." Pei Chichi grunted. Pei Ming did not notice the slight change in her expression. He continued, "If it wasn't for your auntie, I wouldn't have known that Pei Huan found a boyfriend with such a strong family background, even though," he paused for a moment, probably feeling a little regretful. Even though it wasn't very dignified, the boy seemed to be a responsible person. He would have graduated in 2 years and gotten married straight away. Pei Chichi knew that he was talking about Lin Jinrong. She could also guess how Ju Mylin beautified the situation. She did not refute him. If the outcome was already decided, the process was not that important. The most important thing was that Dad was happy. She pursed her lips and smiled. It's good that it's resolved. Pei Ming paused for a long time before sighing. Chichi, Dad has let you down. Of course not. Pei Chichi poured out the soup and fed it to Pei Ming. I'm very happy that Pei Huan has a boyfriend. Pei Ming was relieved and his mood improved. She fed him half a bowl of soup before saying slowly, Dad, I've moved out of home. I'm renting a house with my classmates. Pei Ming was taken aback. He pursed his lips and his expression became unnatural. Chichi, did your auntie bully you? Pei Chichi winked at him and said, Dad, do you think I'm so easy to bully? Every time, auntie would jump up in anger. She paused and licked her suddenly dry lips. I found a job as a working student with my classmate. It's 4,000 a month. Excluding the 1,000 for rent, it's enough for us to eat. Is that so? But students should focus on their studies. Dad can support you. Pei Ming was still reluctant. Pei Chichi pressed the back of his hand and smiled. I know Dad has his difficulties. Pei Ming's eyes were hot, and he almost couldn't hold back his tears. In this life, the only thing that could be used against him was that he had used 500,000 from Ju Meilin's family when he started his business. After getting married, Ju Meilin also knew about his relationship with Chichi's birth mother. Every move he made was like a thorn in his side. He didn't say anything. Pei Chichi shook his hand. Dad, I'm fine now. Look, my face is rosy, and I'm eating well. Pei Ming looked at her for a while longer, his eyes filled with nostalgia. They looked so alike. After a long time, Pei Ming snapped out of his daze and said in a choked voice, Let's eat then. Pei Chichi nodded and the father and daughter didn't say anything else. After dinner, Pei Chichi packed her things and was about to throw them away downstairs. Just as she was about to walk in, Pei Ming called out to her. Chichi. Chapter 21. You just moved out. You'll need to buy some things. I don't have much here, but I still have some money. Pei Ming got off the bed and slowly walked over to put the money in her hand. Take it first. Let me know if it's not enough. He paused and said sadly, I always thought of buying an apartment for you one day and moving out when you're older. But now, it's good that you're moving out. Pei Chichi's heart was also wet. She called out Dad softly and rested her little face on his shoulder. Dad, you have to be well. Pei Ming smiled and put the money in her bag. Be careful on the way back. When Pei Chichi went downstairs, she looked up to stop herself from crying. She told herself that it was all worth it. It was already 10 o'clock when she got back to the apartment in Shia City. She was very tired. She put down her things and went straight to the bathroom to take a shower. Because she lived alone, she didn't even bring her pajamas. She went straight to the bathroom and turned on the hot water to wash her tired body. Suddenly, she heard a crisp sound from outside, like the sound of a door closing. Pei Chichi quickly wrapped herself in a towel and stared at the bathroom door helplessly. Could it be a burglar? There wouldn't be a burglar in such a high-class neighborhood, right? She gritted her teeth and couldn't decide whether she should go and take a look. Then, the footsteps outside got closer and closer. They were coming towards her. Before Pei Chichi could react, the bathroom door was suddenly pulled open. She screamed and reached out to cover her body. She shrank back with all her might and pressed herself against the wall behind her. The person who came was Tang Yu. He was still holding a briefcase in his hand, but he seemed to be slightly drunk. His face was abnormally red, as if he had just returned from a social engagement. His collar was unbuttoned, revealing his jade-like skin. His sleeves were casually rolled up to his elbows. He didn't look like a white-cut chicken. Although it wasn't the kind where the muscles were tangled up, every piece of muscle was well-defined and looked very pleasing to the eye. There was a hint of timidity in Pei Chichi's eyes. She still remembered how wild he was that night. Tang Yu casually threw the briefcase on the table outside. He leaned against the door lazily and looked straight at her body. He also looked a little surprised. He didn't expect to be treated like this today. But he was very, very satisfied. satisfied with what he saw and satisfied with her body. After a long time, he finally said, "Take off the towel." His voice was a little hoarse and gentle, but it was hard to refuse. Pei Chichi trembled slightly, her small mouth pursed into a straight line. At this moment, she had no idea how seductive she was. Her long black hair was soaked in water and stuck to her white and fragrant back. Her eyes were enshrouded, and there was not a single part of her that wasn't beautiful. Tang Yu's eyes darkened. He was probably getting impatient. He repeated himself in a hoarse voice, "Take it off." Pei Chichi's body was tightly pressed against the wall. The wall was very cold, but his gaze was so hot that it almost burned through her. She breathed with all her might and didn't dare to look at him. She looked up like a desperate little animal, struggling hopelessly. Chapter 22. Pei Chichi looked up at him helplessly. Didn't he say he would only come on Friday and Saturday? Why would he appear here now? But Pei Chichi didn't dare to ask, and could only look at him pitifully. Those watery little eyes, innocent and pitiful, completely evoked his conquest jade. Tang Yu obeyed the desire in his heart. He clasped her slender arms and pressed them against the wall. Then, he leaned forward and kissed her. There was a faint taste of alcohol in his mouth, invading her senses. Pei Chichi felt a little hot and dizzy. She was helpless, passively being kissed, her body struggling instinctively. Being kissed wildly by a man who was almost a stranger, and she naturally knew what he was going to do next. However, in such a place, she always felt an indescribable pressure. She shook her head helplessly and resisted slightly, but in return, he kissed her even more fiercely. They were already very close to each other, but he pressed her even more forcefully. Pei Chichi was scared out of her wits. She opened her eyes wide like a pitiful little animal. Tang Yu felt her uneasiness. He opened his eyes and looked at her. Under that kind of gaze, she almost couldn't breathe. She could only helplessly look up at him, her voice extremely weak. "Don't do it here." With that, she lowered her eyes. At this moment, he had already let go of her little hand. She was half bent over with her eyes lowered. That fragile look was very lovable. Tang Yu looked at her deeply for a while and picked her up. Pei Chichi exclaimed and immediately hugged his neck. She was afraid that she would fall. He chuckled softly, probably because he was pleased by her reaction. She froze and stared at him in a daze. Her hair was still dripping wet, and so was he. Just like that, a body full of moisture sunk into the soft bed, the pure masculine scent overbearingly infected her. Pei Chichi was unable to stop it and could only accept it passively. She felt that her body was very strange. Suddenly, Tang Yu raised his head and said in a hoarse voice, "Your thing is here?" "Hair." Pei Chichi opened her misty eyes in shock and looked into his eyes. Tang Yu rolled to the side and said in a cold and hoarse voice, "Go and deal with it." Pei Chichi sat up slowly. The bedsheets were dyed red. She stared at him blankly. Didn't he find it dirty just now? Actually, Pei Chichi had never thought that a man like Tang Yu would actually like that. Tang Yu was indeed shocked. After talking to her, he got off the bed to brush his teeth. Actually, he hadn't kissed her yet. Normally, he wouldn't kiss her, but tonight, he was a little aroused, probably because of the alcohol. The sound of running water came from the bathroom. Pei Chichi shifted her sore body, sat up, and scratched her hair. Tang Yu came out very quickly. He looked at the bed and said lightly, "Still not moving?" Although he said it mildly and without a hint of reproach, Pei Chichi was still a little afraid of him. She immediately got off the bed. Luckily, she had a few tablets in her bag. Otherwise, she didn't know what to do tonight. She cleaned herself up and put on her pajamas. When she returned to the bedroom, Tang Yu was wearing a bathrobe and sitting on the sofa using his laptop. He seemed to be working on some business. Pei Chichi looked at the red and felt a little helpless. Chapter 23. As he said that, he glanced at her. Her little face was so red that it was ridiculous. His lips twitched. Even though it had not eased up, he did not feel the slightest displeasure. Pei Chichi replied with an "oh" and ran over to find a set of grey blankets. After she laid them out, Tang Yu was still focused on his work. she said a little embarrassedly, then I'll go to bed first. Actually, until now, she still had not figured out why he came over today. She waited for a long time, but he did not make a sound. She carefully climbed onto the bed and lifted the blanket to lie down. Perhaps it was because her period was coming, her stomach was very uncomfortable and she could not fall asleep no matter how she tossed and turned. But with him around, she did not dare to get up. After a very long time, she was in a daze when she felt the light switch off. Then, a warm body slid under the blanket, his body was pressed against her back, and one of his arms was around her waist, slowly moving upwards. Pei Chichi woke up. When she woke up, she felt uncomfortable all over. Her stomach was sore and swollen, and his big hand was being too rough on her. At this moment, Tang Yu was feeling what it meant to be on point. Pei Chichi's beauty was not just on the surface. She also had a perfect body. At this moment, what he was holding was soft, delicate, and infinitely beautiful. Even a saint would probably go crazy over it. His face was buried in her little neck. She had just showered, and there was a very pure fragrance. It was a natural body fragrance that made people feel very comfortable. When his lips turned from icy cold to burning hot, Pei Chichi let out a soft moan. Tang Yu laughed out loud. Very delightful. He was not a very experienced man. Pei Chichi was his first woman, but a man's natural instinct was enough for him to get used to it quickly. As long as he teased her a little, she would be defeated. Pei Chichi mustered up her courage and grabbed his hand. He was stunned. What's wrong? Although the location was not right, his tone still had the authority of a superior. My stomach is a little painful, she said softly. Her voice was also very pitiful. Tang Yu's hands stopped messing around, and his whole body didn't move much. Pei Chichi bit her lip, not knowing if he was angry. After a long time, Tang Yu's large palm slowly moved to her belly. The warm palm covered there, and Pei Chichi couldn't help but sigh in comfort. Is this it? His voice was a little hoarse. She nodded. She was too tired today and couldn't resist his good intentions, nor did she want to resist. Tang Yu shifted her so that her head was resting on one of his arms. He turned his body sideways and pressed his face against the side of her face. His hot breath blew into her neck. Pei Chichi blushed a little. In fact, she felt that with their relationship, wasn't this a little too intimate? She knew her identity. A man like Tang Yu would not be easily moved, not to mention that she was bought. She felt uneasy and felt that he had ulterior motives, so she said softly, I'm done. Tang Yu's fingers paused for a moment. Then, he pressed his lips against her ear. Pei Chichi, I'm not done yet. How about this? I helped you, and now it's your turn. He held her little hand. Let's do it here. Pei Chichi now deeply agreed with Chen Xinjie's words. Capitalists were all bloodsuckers. Not only would Tang Yu suck blood, previously, cough cough, accidentally, but he would also exploit her surplus labor force. Chapter 24. Tang Yu did not speak but closed his eyes slightly. Think about it carefully then. He went to sleep, leaving Pei Chichi with her eyes wide open. Her hand was still holding onto his hand, not daring to let go. She raised her eyes and looked at his handsome chin. She wanted to cry. She didn't know how to, at all. After a long while, Tang Yu opened one eye and looked at her expression. Then, he smiled again and closed his eyes to sleep. Although he did not get to have her body tonight, it was still quite interesting. Pei Chichi stayed up for a long time. When she felt that he had fallen asleep, she carefully moved her hand away. For a long time, her hand was numb with his touch. She pursed her lips and wanted to leave his arms, but the moment she moved, her entire body was pulled into his embrace. Originally, it was only a half hug, but now, it was a full hug, and it was very tight. He was hugging her as though she was a little toy. Pei Chichi was well behaved and did not dare to move any more in this position. Her nose was filled with his masculine scent. It smelled good. She slowly relaxed and fell asleep. When she woke up in the morning, her whole body was sore. On one hand, it was because of her period. On the other hand, it was because she had been running all day yesterday. She let out a low moan and heard footsteps. You're awake. Tang Yu was done with his tie. He bent over and looked at her. Get up and have breakfast. I'll send you to school later. Pei Chichi lay there with the blanket covering her chin like a little saint. She stammered, no need. Tang Yu picked up a piece of paper from the bedside table and read it slowly. Politics and economics class at 9 a.m. He paused for a while. If I'm not mistaken, it's already 8:10 a.m. Do you want to take the bus? 8:10 a.m.? Pei Chichi almost jumped up. Gosh, she usually woke up at 6:30 a.m. Why was it already past 8 a.m.? She got up and did not notice that her pajamas had slipped down her shoulders. Tang Yu pulled her back. Wait a minute. His voice was already hoarse. Pei Chichi was stunned. Then, he pulled her into his arms, lowered his head slightly, and kissed that little cutie. It was just a light kiss, not even too lascivious, but Pei Chichi's face turned red. Go change your clothes. He slapped her butt, his voice extremely hoarse. She ran to the changing room and was stunned. Her clothes were not there. Her things were still at home, and yesterday's clothes were soaked in water and could not be worn anymore. She was probably in there for a long time when Tang Yu walked into the changing room. Seeing her in a daze, he suddenly remembered something and made a call to give some instructions. After hanging up the phone, he glanced at her indifferently. Let's go eat first. Oh, Pei Chichi replied. Only then did she realize that she had nothing on her other than a towel. Tang Yu opened the wardrobe and took out a white shirt for her. Put it on. Pei Chichi put it on carefully. The shirt was very big and could be worn as a skirt. It also covered some of her embarrassment. She followed him outside. The hourly helper had already prepared breakfast and left. Tang Yu was a person who valued privacy. Pei Chichi sat opposite him and ate her breakfast in small bites. It was Western food again. She felt that it was a little disgusting. Tang Yu seemed to have noticed her expression as he said indifferently, "You're not used to Western food?" Chapter 25. Tang Yu did not speak again. He swiftly and elegantly finished the sandwich in his hand. Don't eat any more. I'll buy it on the way. Pei Chichi was shocked. She thought that apart from serving him, they would not have much interaction. However, he actually ate breakfast with her and even took care of her mood and taste. This was way beyond her expectations. At this moment, there was a knock on the door. Tang Yu walked over to open the door. There were about 4 waiters standing outside, pushing a row of clothes racks. Tang Yu opened the door slightly and let them in. Pei Chichi stood there motionlessly. He turned to look at her. Go pick one and wear it first. Seeing that she was in a daze, he directly took out a dress and placed it in her hands. He raised his hand to look at his watch. You have to start class in 20 minutes. Pei Chichi looked at the 4 smiling waiters and bit her lower lip. Do you need me to change for you? Tang Yu raised his eyebrows and asked indifferently. Pei Chichi immediately took the clothes and ran to the bathroom. The waiters brought all the seasonal clothes into the changing room. Tang Yu waited patiently outside. Actually, his feelings for her had indeed exceeded his expectations. He was not very obsessed with the female body. In fact, he was a little repulsed by it. Pei Chichi was the only woman he could touch so far. And he was not a playboy. When he did that kind of thing with her, he did not want it to be purely for venting. At least, it had to be within a safe distance. This kind of feeling was not love. He was also not interested in finding more women that he could touch. He was not interested in stripping off one woman after another. Pei Chichi was very beautiful and her character was considered gentle. He was satisfied with her. Moreover, the personality of a little girl was quite interesting to get along with. The waiters moved faster than Pei Chichi and left quickly. Pei Chichi came out in a light pink dress. It was a very pure dress. Tang Yu watched silently for a while. Let's go. Pei Chichi followed about 3 to 4 meters behind him. When they reached the parking lot, he signaled for her to get in the car. She thought for a moment and opened the door to the back seat. Tang Yu got into the car as well. As he buckled his seatbelt, he said calmly, "No one has ever sat in the back seat of my car. She was the first." Pei Chichi's head was about to drop into the Xiong's mouth. She whispered, "We'll be seen." So what if I see it? Tang Yu said and started the car. Pei Chichi didn't dare to think about what he meant. Actually, for Tang Yu, it was not a problem for him and Pei Chichi to be photographed together. He didn't have a girlfriend, nor was he married. It wasn't strange for him to be with a girl of the right age. The high-performance sports car slid into the traffic and arrived at her school in about 20 minutes. He looked around and frowned. What time do you finish school? I'll get the driver to pick you up. No need. I'll take my own car back. She put her hand on the car door and rejected him without thinking. Fortunately, he didn't insist and let her go. He had an important meeting in the morning at 9 o'clock. He raised his hand to look at his watch. It was already 8:55. He was late. He didn't understand why he had to send her to school today. It was probably because he had made her cry last night, and his heart couldn't help but soften. Chapter 26. Tang Yu returned to Shengyuan and went to the office first. The secretary had already prepared the documents. He casually flipped through them and went to the conference room. Meng Qingcheng followed him and smiled. Did you sleep in Xia City last night? Tang Yu's footsteps didn't stop. His voice was slightly cold. Don't talk about personal matters during working hours. Meng Qingcheng smiled and walked with him to the conference room. The topic of today's meeting was to decide the plan for the next half of the year. So, they spent almost the entire day in the conference room. Most of the people showed signs of fatigue after a long period of high concentration, especially the female executives and the secretaries. Only Tang Yu sat at the head of the table. His noble appearance didn't change a bit. During the intermission, the female employees all rushed to the washroom to replenish their powder. The CEO didn't have a girlfriend. Although the gap was a bit big, people still had dreams. What if it came true? Tang Yu flipped through the documents that were sent to him. He wasn't too satisfied. The expression on his face also showed his attitude. The atmosphere in the afternoon meeting was a bit more serious. Everyone tensed up. They were afraid that the CEO would suddenly call their names. Tang Yu lowered his head and didn't say anything. A thin layer of sweat covered the forehead of the executive who spoke. The benefits in Shengyuan were very good. Even the ordinary employees earned more than 10,000 a month. Almost everyone in the middle level and above had an annual salary of 1 million, but the pressure was not small. In the past, when Tang Yu became the CEO, everyone in Shengyuan was quite happy. They felt that they could relax a bit. However, Mr. Tang Jr. was even more of a workaholic than Tang Jiyuan. All the employees in Shengyuan remembered that a few years ago, when Tang Yu took over Shengyuan, he stayed in the company for half a month because of a case. For the employees in Shengyuan, that half a month was like deep water and hot fire. If the boss worked so hard, how could you, a small employee, just stand by and watch? At that time, there were naturally voices of opposition. They felt that Tang Yu was squeezing the employees, but Tang Yu only needed to stand there and Shengyuan's performance doubled that year. Later, Tang Yu became the legend of Shengyuan. He was on the altar. No one dared to question him anymore. Pei Chichi rushed to Shengyuan after school. Because of her period, she walked a little slowly. Halfway through delivering the documents, he felt that the atmosphere today was a little strange. It was especially quiet. Xiao Liu was holding a cup of coffee and wearing Shengyuan's beautiful uniform. Because the higher-ups are having a meeting, she pointed her slender finger upwards and lowered her voice. It's been almost a day. Actually, it's quite pitiful to be a high-ranking official. Pei Chichi sorted out the documents that were to be delivered later and said casually, "Is this still pitiful? The CEO is very fierce." Xiao Liu laughed. "Actually, it's not fierce, it's just majestic." Pei Chichi thought that it must be a particularly dignified, bearded old man. Thinking of that scene, she couldn't help but laugh. At this time, Sister Wen walked out of her office with a stack of documents in her hands. She raised her hands and said to the dozen employees outside, "Kids, hurry up and get moving. The documents that the higher-ups want, now put down all the things at hand." Xiao Liu stuck out her tongue at Pei Chichi and immediately put down her cup. She opened her email and started to deal with things. Sister Wen looked at Pei Chichi. "You. Send the documents to the 71st floor. Don't talk too much. Just pass them to the CEO's secretary, Xiao Ran. Chapter 27. Just as she was about to leave, Sister Wen stopped her. Oh yes, change into a new uniform. She turned around and went to her office to get a new one. Change into this. Pei Chichi took it from her and went to the washroom to change. The female staff uniform of Sheng Yuan was a white silk blouse with a shoulder-strap knee-length black skirt. The quality was good, but the style was very conservative. However, when Pei Chichi walked out like this, everyone gasped. Xiao Liu was the first to exclaim, "This is the first time I feel that our company's uniform is not so pure." That uniform was nothing on them, but on Pei Chichi, it was blatantly seductive and seductive. The waistcoat on top of the jacket clung tightly to her body, accentuating her curves. Especially Pei Chichi. She was very skinny, but she looked very sexy. And her legs were slender, fair, and long. Not to mention men, even women could fantasize about them. Pei Chichi pulled at her clothes, feeling a little uncomfortable. Sister Wen stopped looking at her and handed the documents to her again. Go ahead, we'll do other things when you come back. Pei Chichi nodded and went out with the documents. She took the elevator to the 40th floor. She felt a little bored, so she looked at the documents on the top. It was the first issue of Human Resources, which was updated by Sheng Yuan every year. Pei Chichi opened it out of curiosity. When she turned to the first page, she was stunned. That slightly cold and exquisite face belonged to Tang Yu, who had slept with her last night. And next to it was a small line of words. President, Tang Yu. He was the president of Sheng Yuan? Pei Chichi suddenly remembered that Mr. Zhong seemed to have said something that night, but she had been too scared and nervous that she had forgotten about it. He was in the meeting room. If she went in like this, would he think that she had ulterior motives? She looked at the things in her hands and did not know what to do. Pei Chichi was a little flustered and finally pressed the button for the 42nd floor. She got off the elevator and immediately took another elevator down to the 25th floor, where her bag was. She ran over and took out a pair of black-rimmed glasses from her bag and put them on. She also took out a fiery red lipstick. Chen Xinjie said that big companies needed it as a backup, but she had never used it. After applying it, it matured a lot. Then, she took out a black hairband and tied her hair into a princess hairstyle. He raised his eyes and looked at himself in the mirror. Even he found himself a stranger. He shouldn't be able to tell, right? Pei Chichi did not dare to delay any longer. She picked up the documents and ran to the elevator. He looked at the time. Fortunately, it had only been 5 minutes. However, what she didn't know was that the conference room was very quiet at this moment. Tang Yu's hands were crossed in front of him, and his expression was a little displeased. Everyone was waiting for the documents. Xiao Ran had already made a call, and the HR manager said that the person had come up. Tang Yu did not know what kind of employee he was. It took him 10 minutes to get to the elevator. The door to the conference room was pushed open. A small hand was holding on to the door. It was fair and soft. Then, Pei Chichi appeared at the door. She looked at the dense crowd of about 20 to 30 people sitting there and felt a little dizzy. Soon, her eyes met Tang Yu's. He didn't look very happy, and his fingers were interlocked into a pyramid shape. When she met his sharp gaze, she flinched. She immediately lowered her eyes and walked over quickly. Chapter 28. The male higher-ups immediately felt invigorated, but when they looked at her face, they felt a little disappointed. A pair of thick black-rimmed glasses was enough to dispel many people's desires, not to mention that bright lipstick. Pei Chichi walked over and carefully raised her head to sneak a glance at Tang Yu. His face was still expressionless. And his gaze was very cold. It was completely different from when he was in bed. Her thoughts ran wild and her face was a little hot. She did not dare to look anymore and placed the documents in front of Xiao Ran. Xiao Ran looked at her again and felt that she looked unfamiliar. Pei Chichi put down the documents, bowed slightly and was ready to leave. But when she bowed slightly, a hickey hidden at her collar fell into Tang Yu's eyes. He suddenly narrowed his eyes. Initially, he only felt that it looked a little familiar, but now, he remembered that he had kissed Pei Chichi's neck a little too forcefully last night. Wait a minute. An elegant male voice sounded. Pei Chichi was startled and did not look up for a long time. Tang Yu maintained his posture and his voice was much colder. Which department are you from? Pei Chichi did not dare to speak for fear that she would be exposed. At this moment, Xiao Ran helped her to say, Human Resources sent him. Tang Yu took a look at Xiao Ran and did not ask further. He only said indifferently, you can leave now. Pei Chichi heaved a sigh of relief and realized that her palms were full of sweat. She walked towards the door and Tang Yu's gaze seemed to be fixated on her back. Meng Qingcheng smiled to himself. He believed that Tang Yu had seen through it. However, the uniform that Pei Chichi was wearing really made one's nose bleed. He could not tell, but her figure was really good. Especially that pair of legs, perfectly straight, and very young. Suddenly, Tang Yu swept a glance at him, and Meng Qingcheng couldn't quite smile anymore. After that, the atmosphere seemed to lighten up a little, because the CEO was clearly a little distracted. At 4:30 p.m., Tang Yu took the initiative to end the meeting. Everyone was surprised. They thought that today's meeting would at least last until 8 or 9 p.m. Some of them had even called their families to inform them of their whereabouts. Meng Qingcheng followed behind Tang Yu, saying somewhat mischievously, is the new working student on point? Tang Yu suddenly turned around and stared at Meng Qingcheng. After a while, he rolled up the document in his hand and slapped it at Meng Qingcheng. You're the one who didn't report what you know. Judging from his tone, he seemed rather relaxed. It seemed like he was in a good mood. The two of them walked side by side to the elevator. In the elevator, the argument was put down. Tang Yu looked at Meng Qingcheng. Why is she here as a working student? Meng Qingcheng couldn't help but laugh. She has to eat. Tang Yu frowned. You didn't give her any living expenses? Yeah, I thought it would be better for you to do this kind of thing. Meng Qingcheng winked. Tang Yu didn't say anything else and just adjusted his suit. The elevator stopped and he walked out. Meng Qingcheng followed behind him. You. Aren't you afraid that she has ulterior motives for coming to the company? Tang Yu didn't stop walking. Whether she has ulterior motives or not, she won't achieve it. To him, women were just supplements. He could give her money and even give her a little pampering, but he wouldn't give her anything else. At this moment, Tang Yu didn't expect that one day, he would give his entire self to Pei Chichi, without holding anything back. Chapter 29. He probably didn't realize it was her, right? Pei Chichi continued to send out documents until 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It was even worse than yesterday. Her legs were trembling. She had already changed back into her own clothes and was standing at the bus stop. Tang Yu sat in the car and looked at Pei Chichi. At this moment, the ridiculous glasses and lipstick had been removed, but her hair was still in a ponytail, which made her look very beautiful. The driver was Meng Qingcheng. He teased, do you want to ask Miss Pei to get in the car? No need. Don't tell anyone about this for the time being. Tang Yu replied calmly. Then, he lowered his eyes and started to read the documents. Meng Qingcheng seemed to have understood his superior's intention. What he meant was that this was for the time being. Was this considered a bad taste or a romantic one? The car drove away slowly. Pei Chichi was still standing there alone. After waiting for a long time, the car still hadn't arrived. Hence, she took out her cell phone and dialed a familiar yet unfamiliar number. It was Ju Mylin who answered. Her tone was gentle, which Pei Chichi had never heard before. May I know who you're looking for? Pei Chichi was a little dazed when she heard the voice. The sunlight was especially dazzling. She took a deep breath and said, Auntie, it's me. Ju Maylin's voice immediately turned cold. Chichi, what's the matter? Your father is still in the hospital. Pei Chichi pursed her lips. I want to come back to get something. Is it convenient? Ju Mylin had wanted to make things difficult for her, but when she saw Pei Huan, she suddenly changed her words. What time are you coming back? It's so that I can prepare dinner. No need, Auntie. Pei Chichi didn't think that she would be so kind. I'll leave after I get my things. Ju Meilin's voice was a little bitter. I also said that you don't even want to eat at home now that you're with a big boss. Pei Chichi felt that her eardrums were about to be shattered by her. Auntie, I think there's no need to make things so clear between us. Pei Chichi just wanted to get her things back. Being snubbed, Ju Meilin's voice became colder and harsher. Now that you've grown up, I can't keep you around anymore. I've packed your things for you. By the way, I've also vacated the room. I have a distant niece who came to be city to study and has no place to stay. It would be a lie if Pei Chichi said that she didn't care. Now, she really didn't have a home. Without saying anything, he hung up the phone and got on the bus. An hour later, she returned to her original home. It was especially cold without Pei Ming. As soon as he stepped into the house, he saw an old suitcase and a travel bag in the living room. Ju Meilin was sitting on the sofa with her hands crossed in front of her. Her expression was unusually cold. Pei Chichi, everything is here. Do you want to take inventory? Pei Chichi walked over slowly. She picked up the travel bag and placed it on top of the suitcase. Then, she looked straight at Ju Meilin. Her gaze was cold. Auntie, do you think you can take inventory? Ju Meilin was stunned. She was about to reprimand her. This wretched girl, did she think that she could do anything just because she could fly out? But before she could say anything, Pei Huan stood at the top of the stairs and scoffed coldly. Pei Chichi, for so many years, my mother brought you up. Everything you eat and use belongs to the Peis. Don't you think that you're a traitor for saying something like that? Pei Chichi raised her head and looked over, but immediately, her breathing almost stopped. Lin Jinrong was standing beside Pei Huan. Chapter 30. Pei Huan's voice suddenly became very gentle. Chichi, Mom and I don't want you to move away, but you insist on moving away to live with a man. If you're abandoned one day, you must come back. This was probably the most vicious of curses. Pei Chichi was already used to the mother and daughter's intermittent outbursts. The only thing she wasn't used to was Lin Jinrong's presence. To her, it was extremely embarrassing. At this moment, she understood Ju Meilin and Pei Huan's intentions. Moreover, she understood why Ju Meilin wanted to send her to Mr. Zhong while her father was hospitalized. It was all because Pei Huan liked Lin Jinrong. Pei Chichi smiled and looked straight at Pei Huan. Huan, you too. Pei Huan was furious. She gritted her teeth, but she couldn't go overboard with Jinrong around. If it was any other time, she would have torn Pei Chichi's mouth. Pei Chichi always said that she was good at pretending, but from Pei Huan's point of view, Pei Chichi was the one who was the best at pretending. She looked pure on the surface, but didn't she still climb into a rich man's bed? She wanted to retort, but her wrist was grabbed by Lin Jinrong. Pei Huan, enough. Pei Huan turned to look at him, but Lin Jinrong's gaze was on Pei Chichi's face. Jinrong. Pei Huan said coquettishly. Lin Jinrong let go of her and said coldly, if there's nothing else, I'll go back first. Pei Huan stomped her feet, but she couldn't stop him. When Lin Jinrong walked out, he only nodded at Ju Meilin. As for Pei Chichi, he didn't look at her again. Ju Meilin was unhappy. She felt that Lin Jinrong didn't respect her enough, but thinking of his family background, she tolerated it. When he left, Pei Huan's expression became hateful. She looked at Pei Chichi and said, are you upset? Pei Chichi, let me tell you, Jinrong and I are already together. We've slept together. You can't snatch him away. Pei Chichi picked up her luggage and dragged it out. She said calmly, no one will snatch him away from you. Pei Huan almost screamed, stop right there. Pei Chichi turned around and looked at Pei Huan. Pei Huan, if you don't control your temper, you'll lose what you have sooner or later. With that, she left without looking back. Pei Huan sat next to his mother angrily. He still looked angry. Mom, I'm just a little worried. After all, I was the one who drugged Jinrong. He's willing to take responsibility, but he still likes Pei Chichi, the loser. Ju Meilin sat there and said calmly, what are you afraid of? Jinrong doesn't know. Besides, Pei Chichi has already lost her virginity to another man, and that man is Jinrong's relative. Do you think it's possible for them to be together? Pei Chichi smiled. Yes, she would be the young mistress of the Lin family in the future, while Pei Chichi would just be Tang Yu's mistress. Their identities were far inferior. Zhu Mailin said earnestly, in the future, you'll marry into a wealthy family. Don't make a fuss all day long, lest Jinrong thinks that our family has no upbringing. Pei Huan agreed, but in her heart, she thought, Mom, aren't you the same? Zhu Mailin looked outside again and sneered, Pei Chichi, that bitch, can't do anything. Not to mention the Tang family status, even Tang Yu's father's current wife would not allow Pei Chichi to marry into the Tang family. She would become a joke in the upper class. Chapter 31. By the time Pei Chichi went out, the sky was getting dark. It would take about 10 minutes to walk from there to the bus stop. She dragged her suitcase forward slowly, aimlessly. Blisters had already formed on her feet and they hurt, but she didn't care. Because her heart hurt even more. It was a long road with kapok growing on both sides. It was especially quiet in the summer night, and only her footsteps could be heard. Very quickly, this silence was broken. A sports car drove over slowly and finally stopped in front of Pei Chichi, blocking the road. Pei Chichi stopped in her tracks. The car window wound down. It was Lin Jinrong. He looked at her quietly, his handsome face extremely conflicted. Get in. Pei Chichi took a step back and shook her head. No need. In that instant, she didn't feel fake, but she knew that from the moment she stepped into Tang Yu's bedroom, it was already impossible for them to be together. Liking him might be her last dream. Once she woke up from it, there would be nothing left. Luckily, neither of them said it out loud. Lin Jinrong opened the car door and got out, walking to her. Pei Chichi wanted to pull her suitcase and leave, but he tightened his grip on it. Following that, he said in a slightly hoarse voice, Chichi, I'm sorry. If Pei Chichi was said to be strong, and she was already immune to all kinds of poisons when she faced Zhu Mailin and Pei Huan at the Pei residence, then at this moment, Lin Jinrong's apology still shattered the last trace of softness in her. She moved her hand away and broke free from his grip. She tilted her head slightly, trying to stop herself from crying. She had liked Lin Jinrong before, and perhaps she still liked him now. Like was a more subtle word than love. Love is a kind of emotion that has been thoroughly released, but liking, there is no. That was why it was more beautiful, but also more painful. When her gaze landed on his young and handsome face again, she had already regained her composure. She even had a nonchalant smile on her face. Lin Jinrong, what's there to be sorry about? From now on, you will be my brother-in-law. Also, I am very good now. She looked at him with a smile on her face, but there was no trace of a smile in her eyes. Look at this dress of mine. I didn't even know what brand it was before. It's very expensive. Lin Jinrong, Pei Huan didn't lie. I've already moved out to live with another man. He treats me very well and can give me everything. Pei Chichi looked straight at him without dodging his gaze. Lin Jinrong's eyes narrowed. He grabbed her shoulder and said, Pei Chichi, don't talk about this anymore. Did she think that he would believe her? Even if it was true, he could still give it to her. Lin Jinrong felt a little sad in his heart. Pei Chichi gently broke free from him. Lin Jinrong, don't do this again. She walked forward while he stood behind her. He suddenly shouted at her, Pei Chichi, I like you. Pei Chichi's body froze. She didn't respond, nor did she stop walking. She could no longer bear his liking. The current Pei Chichi was no longer the Pei Chichi of the past. If she could do it all over again, even if Lin Jinrong wasn't with Pei Huan, she thought that she would still walk into Tang Yu's room. Her birth had left her with no other choice. Chapter 32. Lin Jinrong kept looking at her. He knew that it was useless to say all this because he was going to marry Pei Huan. Pei Chichi was crying. She stood in the wind gap. Cars came and went on the road. Finally, she stopped a taxi. The driver helped her carry her luggage into the car and subconsciously glanced at her. It was rare to see such a beautiful young lady. Pei Chichi sat in the back seat and kept looking out of the window. The driver observed her for a long time and sighed softly. Young lady, are you out of love? No. Pei Chichi felt a little uncomfortable and wiped her face with a tissue. The driver smiled. Then what's so sad about it? No. Pei Chichi's voice was a little stiff. The driver smiled even more happily. Then if you're not sad, can you tell me where to go? Pei Chichi came back to her senses. It seemed that she hadn't told him the address. She quickly said, Shia City. Shia City is a high-end residential area. Ordinary people can't buy it even if they have money. The driver cheered. Pei Chichi didn't say anything else. The car stopped. The fare was more than 70 yuan. Pei Chichi gave a 100 yuan bill and the driver got back 50 yuan. Just treat it as a chat discount. Alas, such a beautiful young lady. It was worth it even if she didn't pay. Pei Chichi thanked the driver in a low voice and got out of the car. The driver helped her carry her luggage and shook his head as he watched her walk to the elevator. Sometimes, it wasn't a good thing to look like this. Pei Chichi's eyes were still red. When she walked back, she rubbed her eyes. When she opened the door, she was stunned because Tang Yu was there too. Today was Tuesday, and he came yesterday. Was he going to be here from Monday to Sunday? She slowly closed the door. The sound made Tang Yu, who was handling work, look up. He looked at her and the luggage in her hands and asked calmly, Are you going to get your things? Pei Chichi grunted and dragged the luggage in. Then she asked him hesitantly, Can I put my things here? Tang Yu's fingers left the keyboard and he looked at her seriously, watching the redness in her eyes. After a long time, he said indifferently, Of course. He paused. You can change this place however you want. Pei Chichi nodded in acknowledgement. She dragged her luggage to the changing room and hung up her clothes. She could not help but see the clothes he had prepared for her today. All of them were dressed like ladies, and he seemed to have a preference for white and pink. But underwear was different. It was very mature and sexy. She looked at it for a while and then packed up her things. Finally, she took out a small crystal music box. It was a gift from Pei Ming on her 10th birthday. She still remembered the day when her father held her and sang a birthday song. She had received the most expensive gift in her life. There was only one day when Zhu Mailin and Pei Huan weren't there. That day, she felt like a little princess. She didn't have to look at other people's faces and she could laugh whenever she wanted. All her happiness was given to her by Pei Ming. Tang Yu stood at the door of the changing room and looked at Pei Chichi who was squatting there and looking at the thing in her hands. He recognized it. It was a crystal product from a certain brand. There was a lot of it in Tang Xin's room. But the silly girl in front of him treated it like a treasure. Who gave it to you? He asked a question that even he did not expect. Chapter 33. Tang Yu's expression softened a little. Then you must have a good relationship with him. Pei Chichi didn't say anything. She didn't want to talk about this with him. How could Tang Yu not see it? He smiled faintly. Have you eaten? She wouldn't have felt hungry if he didn't mention it. Now that he mentioned it, she was really hungry. She nodded. Actually, she was afraid that he would suggest doing something else. Tang Yu walked out and said, The helper didn't come today. Do you know how to cook? Pei Chichi was stunned. Yes. Tang Yu thought for a while and turned to look at her. Do you know how to make chicken noodles? Pei Chichi nodded. Chicken shredded noodles it is then. He made the decision on his own. Pei Chichi totally thought that he came here because he was tired of eating out. She started immediately, even though she was already very tired. She thought that it would be easier to serve his stomach than his body. When she was stewing the chicken soup in the pressure cooker, she even thought that maybe her cooking skills were more attractive to him than her body. She could cook for him every day in the future. However, reality was cruel. While she was concentrating on making the soup, a pair of big hands wrapped around her waist, and his warm breath blew on the back of her soft neck. He said in a low and husky voice, How much longer do you need? I'm a little hungry. He raised his hand to show her the time. It was 8 o'clock. Then, he bit her little neck as a punishment. Don't come back so late in the future. Pei Chichi was a little absent-minded after being bitten by him. She wondered if she should talk to him about Monday to Sunday. However, this was obviously not a good time. Fortunately, he only grumbled for a while and left, and she was relieved. Tang Yu walked back to the living room. He wasn't in the mood to deal with work anymore. He tidied up and picked up a magazine to read. From Pei Chichi's direction, she could see him sitting there lazily with his legs crossed, leisurely and elegant. She looked at his profile and felt that he looked familiar, but she couldn't remember where she had seen him before. The chicken soup was ready. She tasted it and filled 2 bowls with it. She scooped the whole chicken out and cooled it down with cold water. Then, she shredded the chicken and put it aside. She washed the vegetables and a few mushrooms. 10 minutes later, 2 bowls of fragrant noodles were served on the dining table. Her excellent cooking skills were all thanks to Ju Meilin's harsh treatment of her. Smelling the fragrance, Tang Yu put down the magazine in his hand and walked over to sit down. Have a taste. Pei Chichi sat beside him and murmured. Her expression was a little nervous. Tang Yu tilted his head and smiled. It smells good. As for its appearance, it was also quite good. He took a bite and found that the taste was very pure and surprisingly good. Tang Yu quickly finished his bowl, put down his chopsticks, and looked at her. Pei Chichi ate very slowly, and there was still more than half of the food in her bowl. Feeling his gaze, Pei Chichi looked up and asked hesitantly, "Do you want to eat more?" Tang Yu didn't say anything, but usually, if a proud man didn't say anything, it meant that he agreed. "I'll go get another bowl then." Pei Chichi had already stood up as she said that. A slender and good-looking hand covered the back of her hand, and an elegant male voice said, "No need." Tang Yu paused, and his gaze fell on her bowl. "Can you eat it?" Pei Chichi was petrified. She shook her head extremely slowly. Was he going to eat the leftovers? Chapter 34. It was as if he was saying, "This project is worth 500 million yuan. Pei Chichi had to admit that she was a little dazed. She was stunned for a while, and then she carefully and hesitantly gave him all the essence in her bowl. On one hand, Tang Yu was pleased by her expression. In her heart, he should be the good-looking type. On the other hand, looking at her actions, he frowned and still sat there. Another bowl. Pei Chichi let out an ah. He had already taken the bowl she was eating and pushed his bowl in front of her. Looking at the way he ate, Pei Chichi was a little dazed. Didn't he find it dirty? But when she thought about how he wanted to kiss her there that night, she felt that it wasn't a problem at all. Tang Yu ate a few mouthfuls. Seeing that Pei Chichi wasn't eating, he raised his eyebrows slightly. "Don't you want more nutrition at this time?" Pei Chichi was a little petrified. Looking at the bowl full of chicken shreds and shiitake mushrooms, the image in her mind was a little white rabbit being fed by a big bad wolf, and in the end, it was eaten in one bite. "Hurry up and eat." His voice was a little deeper, as if he wasn't happy that she was distracted. Pei Chichi didn't dare to think about it anymore. She took small bites of the noodles. Tang Yu looked at her for a while and didn't say anything else. He finished the noodles. Of course, she was the one who washed the dishes. After washing them, she saw him sitting on the sofa dealing with work. Pei Chichi was a little embarrassed. He seemed to be very busy. Luckily, he was busy, she thought secretly. But no matter how busy he was, Mr. Tang still had time to play with his new pet. He was an introverted man. If he didn't restrain himself, she would know how happy he was to have such a little pet, and how he couldn't wait to play with her. He could do this, that, and that again, over and over again. But now she could only think about it. She had her period, so it was better not to scare her. Tang Yu could feel her walking around. Sometimes she took her pajamas to take a shower, and sometimes she went in with a hairdryer. Slowly he became distracted, and the work in his hands no longer interested him. At last he got up and went to the bedroom. Pei Chichi was sitting on the bed, holding her long black hair with one hand. There was still some moisture on it, and it was hanging on her shoulder. Holding the hairdryer in one hand, he concentrated on drying his hair. When he opened the door, she stared at him in surprise. Her legs moved restlessly. Tang Yu's gaze landed on her fair legs. Because her pajamas were rolled up, it was very alluring. Sensing his gaze, Pei Chichi hurriedly pulled up her pajamas and lowered her gaze. She wanted to get off the bed, but when her feet touched the ground, she frowned. Her feet hurt. Tang Yu walked over and stood in front of her. Pei Chichi was very uneasy, afraid that he would do something. Sit on it. His voice was a little hoarse, but it also contained a hidden heat. If Pei Chichi knew more about the love between a man and a woman, she would understand that it was a sign that a man was aroused. She was a little scared, but she didn't dare to disobey him, so she sat down obediently. Tang Yu sat beside her, reached out to hold one of her little feet, and placed it on his knee. There are blisters, he said calmly as he looked at the white, transparent thing that was the size of a soybean. Oh, Pei Chichi replied. Feeling that he wanted to touch it, she couldn't help but scream, no. Chapter 35. She was afraid of pain, and he didn't look like he was going to get angry. Hence, she mustered her courage and said, adults are afraid of pain too. He looked at her for a long time before saying slowly, why weren't you afraid that time? Huh. It took Pei Chichi 5 seconds to realize what he had said. Her face immediately turned red. From her cheeks to her ears, and down to her neck, her entire body was pink. She was cute and sexy at the same time. Tang Yu's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't that he hadn't seen beauties before, but for such a young little thing to sit by his bed and tell him that it hurt, his heart couldn't help but soften a little. He suddenly carried her. Pei Chichi was shocked and immediately hugged his neck, afraid that she would fall off. However, he only carried her onto his lap and said in a deep voice, sit properly. Pei Chichi didn't dare to move and just sat there quietly. Actually, she didn't think that he would be willing to do such a thing for her. No matter how clean her feet were, they were still feet. She stole a glance at him. His face was filled with a sense of intimacy. If she hadn't leaned in close, she wouldn't have known that he had turned into a wolf. However, she didn't know that all men were so perverted. Tang Yu bent down slightly and held her little feet again. They were fair, tender, and especially soft. Pei Chichi felt that the blister was a little painful. She knew that he was going to help her squeeze it. She was afraid. Her little hands hugged him tighter and her little face was buried in his neck. His masculine scent calmed her down a lot, but there was a tinge of panic in her heart. She wanted to move away, but the pain in her feet made her hug him even tighter. To Tang Yu, this was a rather big test. She was hugging him so tightly that their bodies were almost sticking to each other. He was a little annoyed, so he used more strength. Pei Chichi howled in pain and then, she bit his shoulder in a very offensive manner. Tang Yu's body froze, but his hands didn't stop moving and continued to pop her blister. Pei Chichi didn't let him go either. He retracted his hand and cupped her little face along her curves. Pei Chichi panted and lowered her eyes, not daring to look at him. She could feel how hot his eyes were looking at her. Her body, slightly trembling, unspeakably fragile. After a long time, she looked up, and before she could react, her lips were kissed by him. Her hair was scattered messily over her shoulders, and her little hands were still wrapped around his neck. Tang Yu kissed her passionately, holding her little head with one hand. Her body trembled, and she was at a complete loss. Her small body was warm, with a hint of fragrance after bathing. Tang Yu finally let go of her little mouth. Pei Chichi fell weakly on his shoulder, and the breath that came out from her little mouth was fragrant and sweet. His fingers moved her little face, and she looked away awkwardly. Her little mouth was as red as a rose. Tang Yu's fingers caressed it gently, and his gaze was a little deep. Pei Chichi couldn't take it anymore. Her entire body was like a reed in the wind, breaking at any moment. Finally, as though he had had enough, he let go of her and chuckled. He put her aside and walked outside, returning with a first aid kit. Pei Chichi cried out softly, "I'll do it myself." You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.